My Philosophical Ideas 2. Antonio.P. Copyright author, layout, and cover design. Antonio.P. Published in April 2016. Foreword. This book represents the second part of the items shown in my blog, The Road to the New Era. Once gathered a certain amount of them, I turned into PDF and get on the internet so they can be downloaded for free. The truth is that the reason life is obtaining happiness and not getting money, because money can help but does not guarantee it. The main objective of these publications is primarily encourage free dissemination of ideas and encourage readers accustomed to think freely, without submitting to the topics of each era. This book has been translated from the original Spanish version. Chapter 1, Medicine. Flu Tips. Few people know that in fact the flu does not need any medication to cure because it is the immune system itself that heals us. It is nevertheless true that the difference between healing is quick and easy or slow and difficult. It can depend on how we treat it. Here I propose some tips that I think are useful. First, a measure that I consider advisable: not to spend the duration of the illness in bed, because even bother not why we cancelled as people. The horizontal position may favor the onset of fever and headache with increasing pressure. Blood in the brain also causes an imbalance in sleep rhythms, making it more difficult to sleep at night. Right is being horizontally alone at night. It is also useful to combat the disease. Avoid possible cough. Infection usually attacks among other body parts throat, but the more you cough, more irritated and cough worsens. Is only useful cough when phlegm formed in the coughing and breathing tube is then suitable means expel. It is also recommended nose blowing gently to avoid breakage of fine blood vessels that are found in it. Another useful measure is to avoid excessive temperatures in homes. It contributes to increasing fever and also dries the airways. It is also helpful to avoid excessive shelter, especially in the afternoon, that is when the fever rises. Another useful measure is to avoid overmedication, as usually is our own immune system that heals us. Why rush into taking medications can be a hindrance rather than a solution. Fever in mild form may also be useful, as it increases body temperature, causing blood is more fluid. Besides, inflammation often associated increases the diameter of the veins, allowing the arrival of more blood to the infected area and therefore helping more antibodies to fight infection, so it is advisable to use anti-inflammatory only in case of high fever. It is also useful to do some form of exercise during illness, as this, apart from strengthening our body, stimulates blood circulation. One of the symptoms that may indicate the onset of flu is the sense of smell of burning caused by virus activity in the olfactory glands or changes in the way we perceive the flavors. Tips against migraines. In fact, many headaches are caused by allergies, so it is necessary to be informed whether you are experiencing one. With the aim of preventing allergies to pollen or dust are well known, but one that may go unnoticed is allergy moisture. This allergy begins with inhalation of steam. This steam burns the skin overlying the sinuses, causing a small infection. In order to promote blood flow and eliminate the infection, the body causes an increase in the size veins that connect the nose to the brain, resulting in fever and headache. Nasal symptoms of this infection can be confused with cutting digestion, because the dilated veins in the brain compresses other vessels, may cause loss of vision, memory, or feeling of paralysis of the left side of the face. Water vapor could also explain some cases of asthma or pneumonia, because being exposed to it in excess could encourage spore or virus attack our lungs. The children. It is a misconception that children are people without importance, because it is in that part of life when they acquire their personality. Even in the stage of babies, it is important not to forget about them and actively participate in their education. Parents should provide their legs, catching them children in their arms to show them things, because although they cannot walk, their vision and memory capacity are widely developed. It is also necessary that parents are best friends and play with them, that it should not be seen as an effort for children give the same care they receive. The good thing about children is that when they are young have not yet acquired the prejudices that are common in an adult, because there have been prejudices at all times, sometimes result from ignorance, and other manipulation of the facts so interested. The problem is that real few prejudices are sometimes considered as such at the time in which they have and only later recognized. Therefore it is important to analyze things objectively, trying to avoid drawing hasty conclusions, i.e. what Today it is considered an adult personality is the result of assimilating many wrong but practically forced acceptance by the mass social beliefs. Adults should learn from children the joy of living, because regardless of how old you are, every day is a new opportunity to be happy, as our body allows us must do whatever we want within our means. It should also take into account the views of children, because although they have less knowledge than adults does not stop having feelings or they can be right sometimes, for no one for many knowledge you have can know everything besides talking to them and listen to their views is positive in its development. A child is a person not a cabinet and when it is small has a great desire to learn, but it's as if you were at the bottom of a dark pit in which only light at the end is why adults should help them directed towards the light, giving them the knowledge they lack to be adults. Order and mania. In all activities of life would be desirable to establish an order to things done more effectively. The order consists of performing the tasks in an hour or so preset is not only a tool to facilitate the smooth running of tasks but it is also good for health as a continuous change of customs hampers far-sighted ability of our body. A good practice would be for example sleep 7 or 8 hours a day and these hours of wakefulness and sleep were the same and the same hours both weekdays and holidays. Another positive measure would not interject holidays in the middle of working days, this would lengthen life and improve health. It is also true that abuse the development of customs can be counterproductive. It is what is called compulsive or hobby activity. This behavior can have two main causes, one is caused by a deterioration of health, and the other occurs as result of nerve pressure and stress. This means that when a methodical and organized person by nature is subjected to great pressure, tends unconsciously to exaggerate customs in order to leave more free mind and increase your concentration before the possible occurrence of these unforeseen problems that cause stress. While it is true that excess in the planned customs is inadequate, it is also true that perform daily activities in an orderly manner reduces errors, increases concentration on tasks, and can increase the available memory capacity, being automatic, provided many of the usual processes. Disease or vice. Today it is very common that any deviation will end by calling disease. This is because we live in a very competitive society in which no one wants to consider loser. Why? It'll hide the vices presenting them as alleged diseases. An example is the increasingly widespread practice of using food as mere entertainment, as a result of obesity. In fact, it appears in developed countries this is already the qualifier epidemic. It is true that there are some people with a genetic predisposition to gain weight, but this predisposition does not require them to eat more than necessary, but acts to increase the feeling of hunger. Therefore, it is clear that only with dietary control can prevent overweight and vice hide behind the illness is not exactly a very healthy behavior. Another example is the use of alcohol or drugs. Often this ends in the development of an addiction, but to keep the good name now drunk sick call themselves, however, is an act of hypocrisy appear before all as alleged sick, but at the same time they forget that this addition was the consequence of vice of drinking beyond what the body could bear, but recognize that of course would stain his good name. Society should not make the mistake of collaborating in that vice presenting him as alleged illness disguising, because all additions are the result of a defect developed for a long time and although it is true that this defect causes an addition is also true that the origin of this addition are the bad habits. Moreover, any can be eliminated if the substance is gradually reduced the causes. Society should not make the mistake of covering up the habit, much less accept the existence of mitigating for those who commit crimes while under the influence of drugs, because the only way to eradicate such behavior is precisely not protecting them when their vices hurt innocent. Chapter 2, Policy. Freedom of opinion. It is pathetic to see that when the media talk about freedom of opinion generally refer to the freedom to indulge the line marked by the great powers. This is because as soon as someone gets out of those parameters you are immediately accused of being antisocial and words are invented to associate your opinion with diseases in order to discredit him. Actually, these people are just opportunists who sail to our current and always associated with the power of his time. These if they are traitors to humanity, because it is assumed that every idea should be respected provided that raise peacefully, but when someone leaves the truths established by the powers that arise quickly voices calling for them to tape the mouth. Could it be that they fear citizens to express their right to think freely? These who speak of freedom of expression, but only when it favors what they want, are no better than those who burned scientists to tell the truth during the Middle Ages. And I say this about those who today persecute those who condescend to the mixing of races or homosexuality, once invented words like xenophobia and homophobia in order to prevent citizens from assess the following facts objectively. They are not able to understand that respect is not the same work, and the fact that one respects those who support homosexuality does not mean it's right, and therefore not obliged to cooperate with it. But these opportunists just hope the prize to go in line with the great empire of the United States, that empire which speaks of human rights and at the same time allows for millions of poor in the streets, usually of ethnic minorities, the miscegenation empire that supports only to justify the occupation of the rest of the world and refuses to recognize racial boundaries so as not to recognize the policies. It is true that the Nazis were cruel to ethnic minorities during World War II, but that does not mean we should therefore destroy our own racial and cultural heritage through crossbreeding. All races are entitled to live in freedom, but that does not mean the interbreeding helped to this end, but on the contrary, today it is taboo to talk about this issue. The pro-miscegenation say it is wrong to oppose the crossing of races because they say they are all part of the same species, but if the case of discovering a human species most backward on a desert island, it would also maintain the barbarous pretense of allowing the crossing of this with today's humanity and thereby destroy the fruit of thousands of years of genetic progress? Because they would oppose recognizing that differences in racial progress are possible, and therefore reject miscegenation is defensible without this implying a desire to harm the other races. So I consider it a mistake to oppose those who advocate peacefully rejection miscegenation or racial superiority, because this wave of support for the current crossbreeding does not pursue more than pandering to a new imperialism that seeks to justify claiming that his rejection of Nazi legitimizes them but actually only pursues the same imperialist aims. Also they are mistaken who simply limited to condescend and justify Nazism in the Second World War, because that kind of ideology can only evolve if they are able to get away proposed by Hitler and recognize the right of all races to live freely approach, as the only used the movement for the defense of racial integrity because he believed he could further their nationalist interests, but that does not mean that that line of thinking is in itself bad. The Nazis actually only sought power and create in Germany a dictatorship and did not hesitate to lie and use anything that might put them favor. They were carried away by extremism and that was a big mistake. But that does not mean why we're wrong at all, as the victorious powers wanted us to believe. The big mistake that was made after the Second World War was to believe that the defense of humanism and respect for racial rights necessarily implied acceptance of miscegenation, and such is not true. In fact, every race is different because of their adaptation to different climates of the earth, and only for this reason it is justified to oppose the mixing of them, but it is also necessary to say that it is precisely these harsh climates causing existence best and worst races, because perfection is the result of finding the right balance in everything, and the racial question the European race represents that balance by having developed in the most ideal climate. In the future, all races will end up being the same, but not by exterminations, nor by interbreeding, but because the result of the evolution of these will come a day when the progress of cities will create an ideal climate in all of them and consequently stimulate the development of the races to make them equal. But until that time comes, it is absurd to destroy the racial miscegenation heritage. It is necessary to foster fraternal coexistence among all races, but that does not mean it's right that these are mixed. The progress of mankind is based on progress from chaos to order, from darkness to light, and that will only be possible if the decision of nature to divide mankind into different races is respected, since this division also represents progress. The dilemma of Germany. It is regrettable to see how today the Germans are divided between those who are in favor of the victorious powers of the Second World War and therefore against Nazism, and who declare themselves against the victors of the war and consequently in favor of the Nazis, as both positions are wrong. There are many people who think that the only way to defend freedom is supporting the Nazis without understanding that it was precisely these that gave their country to foreign powers, praising Hitler as if God were considered unpatriotic to anyone who criticizes him. But if you care to know history or realize that Hitler was no military genius they believe, their only success during the war was the conquest of France, for everything else were failures and their alleged successes were Actually, concessions Western nations gave in order to avoid war, but its policy was completely erratic. His first big mistake was to attack England without sufficient means, attempting a sea blockade when had a fleet far below his, and when it became clear his failure attacked Russia in order to cover it up. This was from a strategically military barbarity, for violating the peace treaty was signed with her country condemned to certain failure by putting all major nations against him. If Hitler had stopped the war at that time, probably he would have ended, but his unlimited desire for power led him to perdition. It is true that the conditions of the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I favored the rise of Nazism, but it is also true that the Nazis had not come to power without the economic crisis of 1929, but it is necessary to consider that crisis affected not only Germany but the whole world. The Nazis used a strong campaign of mental manipulation in order to convince citizens that they understand them and be able to solve their problems. By putting the Jews as allegedly responsible for all the evils, they were used as a means for society could vent their discomfort with them, blaming a minority supported by the remaining majority, so thus ensured the society did not realize that the danger was in them and did not realize that Hitler's hatred of Jews simply was because he did not consider them sufficiently nationalists for supporting these peace treaty in the First World War. Another reason for the persecution against them was the economic motive, because by putting them outside the law could seize their possessions. The Nazis accused Jews of being better off financially than the rest of the Germans, but they did not say is that it was precisely the European laws of the Middle Ages which provoked it, because for a long time forbade Christians to work in banking and make loans. Such discrimination in favor of the Jews were the Europeans themselves an example of those who favored economic myopia, that antipathy toward them. The truth is that if a comparison of the results is made, Germany was better placed at the end of the First World War to the end of the Second, so if you have to look unpatriotic, obviously that would have to be Hitler. For his disastrous policies he condemned his country to ruin. Militarism is not always the solution. The pro-Nazi should note that the Allied nations against Hitler awarded him almost everything he asked in order to avoid war, and yet he was determined to provoke, therefore evident his total ignorance of the possibilities that his country had to win the war. Those who today defend the thesis Nazis have to understand that criticizing Hitler is not the same as criticizing Germany, and be against Hitler does not imply being against Germany, because Hitler can make mistakes like other people. To progress must understand this truth and therefore have to be willing to make a self-criticism and change those things that are wrong in their ideology. It is essential to accept that defend their race does not have to be linked to abuse others. Actually, the Nazis did not invent philosophy towards racial integrity, because he existed before them, but they served this ideology only because they believed that could favor their nationalist ideas. Therefore the fact defend these ideas does not imply that have to agree with the necessarily Nazi. Also are despicable who say everything about the Nazis is bad, because nobody is wrong in all. Frivolously hidden in the Versailles Treaty, conditions for Germany were excessively harsh, and the desire of the Nazis to unite all territories' German culture under one banner was legitimate, but the mistake of the Nazis did not know how to find the right measure to things, because his desire for power was unlimited, as demonstrated when they locked themselves in jail, his political opponents, turning the country into a dictatorship. Nor was nothing wrong with the fact of wanting to defend their race against miscegenation, because for many German and European race was a symbol of identity that had to also defend. For the Germans it had special meaning because after the Romans tried to conquer the Germanic territories in the time of Emperor Octavian, he distrusts the West was higher, and defending race served to reinforce their own identity. In addition, before the war to keep the pure race was considered by all as a symbol of good education, and only after the German defeat this changed, because from that moment those who were defending racial purity automatically were considered pro-Nazi and therefore enemies of the victorious powers of war, as if it were the same thing can be against miscegenation but also against the Nazis. They forget that before the outbreak of the difficult war was to find someone who openly support miscegenation, be in favor of keeping the race pure, or believe that a race may be more evolved than another does not mean for it being in favor of slavery or the mistreatment of other races, as happened with the Nazis. It is commonly accepted by all that the human species is superior to other animal species, but defend this does not mean that therefore the extermination of other species rests. therefore argue that the white race is more evolved than the rest of races also have to involve the abuse of these rests, as each plays a role in the earth and each must evolve peacefully and in freedom. It is actually adapting to different climates in some extreme cases what determines the differences between them and why they are necessary, but this adaptation is also because the European race is better and more beautiful to be found in the tract of land with a more balanced climate. It is also important to note that the fact that a race can be considered superior to another does not mean that therefore every individual of the most advanced race has to be considered better than each individual of the other races, because it is only the evolutionary value means what that changes. Racial differences is on aesthetics where more accentuated, but that does not mean you have to be significant differences in other things like the level of intelligence, for example. This does occur however when it comes to different species. Perhaps, eventually, all races become equal when the man with his technological advances manages to create an identical artificial climate in cities that do evolve, but in the meantime, crossbreeding is an act of genetic anarchy and mockery of the natural order. At present the white race is causing their own extinction by refusing to take the seed needed to replace its inhabitants and to promote racial miscegenation. This really is a true crime against humanity, but few want to acknowledge so as not question the preset topics. After the war the Americans and French used their alleged support of miscegenation to justify their imperialist campaigns, claimed that the fact of allowing miscegenation within its borders gave them the right to invade the territories of other races, so did the opposite of what they were proposing, i.e. invade and exploit those territories, according to them for their sakes. When he moved them truly was greed, as in the invasion of Iraq, which lies to justify it were used and so to appropriate its oil. It is true that democracy is better than dictatorship, but that cannot be used as an excuse to do whatever they want and destroy a country. Every nation must be respected so that it can evolve by itself without pretentiousness impositions, plus such interference only they serve to give ammunition to extremist groups. With these behaviors condemn the West to lose their culture just by the desire for more money, as if they had no ethical value, thus creating greater social tension by trying to impose racial mixtures but without really worrying about human rights. I just would return to reason and give each ethnic minority territory within the United States by the percentage that corresponded and that each race can thus create their own free nation. Ideally worldwide racial boundaries were respected, to avoid the risk that some races may interfere in the affairs of others. But that can only happen when you assume that interbreeding does not help humanity, but promotes the exploitation of some races over others besides destroying the identity of each race. It is necessary that those who believe in the defense of racial integrity dissociate completely from the Nazi era and understand that the defense of one's own race does not have to be in contradiction with respect for the rights of others. Nor should we forget that the first casualty of war is truth loser. Its successes are considered flaws and defects winner are considered virtues. It is necessary to analyze things impartially, without being carried away by the comfortable opportunism of seeing things only for those who win wars, because they may have the power but not the reason. Actually, not that the power and media change the feelings of people, what changes is the way people think should express these feelings. Making power is to direct these feelings towards their own interests by changing the interpretation of the facts are historical or scientific. For this reason after the war Nazi crimes were considered inhumane acts, but the Indian extermination in the United States a legitimate act of self-defense, all about how to raise the facts rather than the facts themselves, even in cases involving similar situations, is the same mental manipulation which was then used to justify the Iraq War. These governments use both lying and intimidation to achieve their ends, and many citizens tend to agree with them only out of fear, and therefore accept their arguments without analyzing impartially, so the concept of what is prejudice and what it not simply depends on what determine the dominant powers of the time. Much blame for this social confusion lies with the speculators who during the war supported the Nazis and now fervent defenders of miscegenation declare, because such people do not seek the truth, only to profit harming society. People should ask what would have been his values to win the war. The Germans would surely be very different, because it is not the same as saying it is fair to really be. The real challenge is to be able to seek the truth staying out ideological fashions of the times, because all power no matter how great carries a baggage of the same mistakes that hit, and this must know how to recognize. Someday reach a new time when people will no longer accept leadership represented by justice and truth. Religion and race. Since the end of the Second World War, the discussion on the preservation of racial and cultural identity of each people became a taboo subject, but it is important to remember that even in the essence of the Christian religion there is a clear tendency to oppose miscegenation of races. It is pathetic to see how society considers as natural defend the existence of all varieties of each animal species, yet since the end of World War II is pursued proponents' preservation of human races without mixing, and all because who he lost that war proposed such ideas. Is it that you are so naive to believe that whoever loses has to be wrong war at all? It pursues only one goal, which is to consolidate and elevate the winner, which promotes mixing only in order to show different from the Nazis, but that his real intention is to hide while carrying out its own campaign of world domination. You need to understand that each race is the answer to the adaptation of the human species every climate of the earth. They forget that even in the same biblical tradition condemning such practices as abhorrent, but now this truth is muted. Because confused to defend racial identity does not have to involve desire no evil to others. They forget that it was nature itself which divided mankind into different races and are actually different, although many insist on denying it. Because there is nothing dishonest in trying to maintain their own race without mixing, and the fact that a person who believes in these ideas has committed a dishonest act does not imply that all those who have these ideas also are. You shall not sow your vineyard two kinds of seed, because all be unclean, sowing seed which the product of the vineyard. Deuteronomy 22.09. It is true that it is wrong to assess the content of the Bible without making constructive criticism, as much that this book can be appreciated for its moral content. That's not a reason to stop using our own reasoning, especially if that its supposed divine origin is somewhat alleged but not proven, as well as any changes that eventually these writings may have suffered. But it is also true that anyone who now defends peacefully is morally right to maintain their own race without mixing is immediately silenced for not being in line with the prevailing power of the moment, and that is also an opportunist act against freedom. It is also important to emphasize that racial differences are primarily the result of the adaptation of each race to different climates of the earth, and the fact that this adaptation determined that some races may be better than others. It should not be used as a pretext for pretend to have advantage over others, because although the mixing can be considered a mistake, that does not change the fact that we are all human beings with the same right to be happy and to live in freedom. Islamist extremism. It is striking to see how the extremist Islamic groups show an increasing cruelty, and it is also striking that the number of supporters of these terrorist groups seems to gradually increase. It is unfortunate that this happens because their ideological approaches are manifestly contrary to respect for human rights and freedom of expression, i.e. are generally the worst elements of society who end up forming such groups, and their ambition for power seems limitless. However, it is also necessary to remember that it is the greedy Western policy towards the Muslim world the main driver of these groups, as systematically whenever the UN poses a sanction against Israel for its policy of occupation and extermination of the Palestinian people, United States blocks it. When Israel kills its bombing hundreds of Palestinians, most of them are civilians, the Western world considers a simple news story, but when an Islamic terrorist group kills a Western, all scandalized. By saying it is an act against freedom and fraternity. Do they mean that the life of a Muslim is irrelevant, but an Israeli or an American not? The United States wants to show to the world how a judge and lord impartial. But how fair you can consider who slaughters a million Iraqis leaving the country destroyed, claiming to seek weapons of mass destruction when they know perfectly well that do not exist. Because what they really wanted was to control its oil while providing nuclear weapons to Israel, in addition to finance his army, even knowing that this country takes decades illegally occupying Palestinian territory. At the end gives the impression of being true to say Islamist groups that we are witnessing a new covert crusade, because U.S. policy is to provide all necessary means for Israel to steal more and more territories to the Islamic world through their settlements, and if a war is declared to have the possibility of exterminating their nuclear weapons, i.e. it can be assumed that the United States prefers to be Jews rather than Muslims who control the territories considered religious significance for Christians, but this it shows that in any case its policy has nothing impartially and continuous source of conflict between the Islamic world and the West. But the most unfortunate thing is that Israel is using the Palestinian people with the same policy of extermination that the Nazis used against them. Do they not learn anything from what happened in the Second World War? And if not so, why not return freedom to the occupied territories? The Western world is losing this issue a great opportunity to demonstrate freedom and fraternity that both preaches. It is true that extremists seek to impose the world a mentality of the Stone Age of modern times, but the saddest thing of all is that those countries the forefront of progress believe that cruelty to the world Islamic they are favoring the rise of such groups. They are causing the citizens of those countries confuse extremism freely. Inertia masses. It is regrettable to see how the masses tend to have a single thought. It's like they do not want the trouble of analyzing things to have an evolved opinion. From the moment an idea or ideological current becomes assumed by most seem as if a mental black hole that tends to attract people to him preventing such abandoned dogma was formed. But worst of all is that when someone tries to move away from such beliefs, hyenas of society, i.e. speculators, are poured over attacking them mercilessly. These speculators interpret that departure as an opportunity to take advantage by distancing these people the truths or beliefs politically accepted by the majority. Then speculators appear to others as supposed defenders of the mass when in fact only seek personal gain. These kinds of people do not seek the truth and are characterized in each period for trying to take advantage of the political spurts, always going with the flow. They are the same as during the Nazi era extolled the regime, and from the end of the war vigorously they pursued those who defended racial purity peacefully. Speculators were also those who supported McCarthy, who in the United States, tried to obtain political advantage scaring citizens against those who merely exercised their right to think differently. Another example is the ideological rigidity of political parties in this system misnamed democracy, since different ideas to the dogmas of the initial orthodoxy are persecuted so that they end up considering that the members of each party have to take their postulates as set in stone, turning the rough parties have unable to progress adequately. Just as you try to manipulate the minds of his followers that it is said that all the evils correspond to the opposition parties and all the virtues to himself. This will not end until society realizes that it is necessary to pass from voting parties to vote on ideas. Another similar example is religious dogmas. The leaders of such organizations proclaim the infallibility of its principles to create a mental dictatorship, pretending to citizens who think freely is an attack against God or religion, but do not say it what matters is less good or truth, and only used such arguments to their advantage, making believe that citizens doubt the dogma is wrong. These rascals pretend representatives considered only serve God when Satan, and intended to consider the truth as an exclusively his property without room for any difference of opinion. People should look at things objectively and unmask those speculators who scare people with lies and thus achieve a truly free society. The world has become a great facade in which the important thing is not democracy but pretend that there is democracy. What matters is not justice but to pretend that there is justice. But you cannot solve this without assuming a certain amount of self-criticism, because in reality a country always has the government it deserves, because the low moral disposition of the political class is merely the symptom of poor moral mood of the society it is representing, and in many cases have voted for him. Military inertia. It is regrettable to see how the great nations tend to lean too easily to war and imperialism. An example of this is seen in the excessive tendency of the United States to seek wars with which to pay for arms companies by major economic support received during election campaigns. When these parties-funded enterprises came to power, arms they return the favor, provoking wars to justify military spending. At the beginning of the Cold War, the United States considered appropriate allying with Israel in its confrontation with the Soviet Union for world domination, and that resulted in many of the Islamic countries became enemies to be at odds with Israel's policy theft of land to the Palestinians, and Islamic countries became a field to create appropriate test to justify wars with arms spending. On the other hand, the United States was fixated on creating a circle of allied countries around Russia with which to strangle his influence. Hence its interest attract the governments of the Baltic and Ukrainian republics, also carried out a policy of continuous interference in the internal policies of the countries of the Middle East using the pretext that only wanted to impose democratic models for their sake. but could not hide their interest in mastering their internal policy to assist and control the oil business. After that, it went to fund Islamist guerrillas to overthrow governments that were not favorable to them in Afghanistan and Syria without considering that these guerrillas derive in many cases anti-Western terrorist groups. After the destruction of Iraq in the two Gulf Wars, this country was so weak he could not contain the entry of terrorist groups such as the Islamic State, in a way also funded by the US to overthrow the Syrian government, and all this not for promote democracy but to take support Russia in its fight for world domination. For this reason I believe the recent policy towards the Middle East by the United States is a serious mistake, because Islamic countries have the perception that only a relationship with them arises through force and intimidation, while Israel allows land theft and destruction of Palestinians. Finally, after all, are Muslims. Citizen holidays. Formerly, the city councils of people regularly organized parties because of the difficulty of citizens to make them individually. Today in modern cities there are plenty of nightclubs prepared for it. For this reason, it is incomprehensible that municipalities frequently blocked with normal activity of cities to organize parties, because it represents a clear violation of citizens' rights to rest and silence. It is regrettable that human beings store both doing things en masse, as if responding to a hypnotic pulse that forces you to do, condescends to the shows organized by municipalities even knowing that they are nothing more than a display of alcohol and consumerism. This behavior resembles more a herd of wildebeest in the jungle, a group of intelligent people. The same goes for the fireworks. It is surprising that the population be interested something that is essentially nothing more than a simple succession of more like a bombing explosions at a party, especially if we consider that there is a part of the population such as young children or animals are cruelly tormented by these explosions without anyone seems to care. Therefore, it is reasonable that society applies in this issue some sanity and decides to perform noisy activities only in the soundproof rooms created for it. Municipalities have a duty to be neutral and refuse to turn the streets into simple taverns or nightclubs, albeit temporarily. Their duty is to consider public health and the rights to rest as their priorities and not mere profit motive that these scandals represent. An evolved society is characterized by knowing that the interests of one party does not have to impose on others. The false environmentalists. Today we are used to seeing many environmentalists' demonstrations, but how many of those environmentalists' assumptions prove with facts and not just with words? Because it is very easy to accuse politicians of all, but it is more difficult to prove what they say with facts. How many of those attending the demonstrations continually buy clothes that do not need and then throw the used and still in good condition, or torn clothes are bought when it would be more logical to buy new and abrade with use? How many of them abuse the food, while there are so many hungry people in the world? These people have already discovered the pleasure of eating, now have to discover the pleasure of eating only what is necessary, because that is also an art. How many of them throw food simply by not repeating the same thing the next day? How many of them despise the sunlight coming day and sleeping at night? How many of them live at home with their parents and even taking work refuse to help with expenses or household chores and spend everything you earn in useless vices? If you have the same compassion for their parents than they have for their pets, the world would be much better. How many of them use the car to take a person, when it would be much more environmentally friendly use public transportation? How many of them catch the car to go to town every weekend, even knowing the great pollution that will cause? Because a car consumes in each of those trips as much oxygen as it spends a human being in his life. It will always be more logical and clean stroll through the city park. How many of them collect garbage when they eat in the field or the beach? How many of them live in cities with dogs and have no qualms about allowing dirty streets with urine and feces? It will always be more logical to have children and not dogs and animals return to nature, which is where they belong, instead of living as mere slaves of people. It is clear that many of those who call themselves environmentalists are nothing but whited sepulchres who looks very nice in the pictures out of newspapers insulting politicians when they should be a thorough analysis of self-criticism. They do not understand that the world is in a state of decline precisely because people do not like to think, much less change. Apparently they believe is much better look at the speck in your neighbor's eye but forget the beam in their own. The absurdity of fashions. It is sad to see so many people dominated by the obsession to look cool, and the worst is that often that fashion is not followed by choice but by not contradict most, because in fact the main reason for people to follow it is fear. Fads are not very different from the group to use the same customs or the same jackets, tattoos. Usually those who join these groups follow fads, or what they want is to feel safe, protected by the mass of people acting the same way. The trouble is when fashion dominates people and not people to fashion, because then the barbarous traditions that still exist today as sexual mutilation or torture and other ridiculous as wearing torn clothing or using a kurtai, although infinity that exist because many people when deciding whether to do something just set in whether it is fashionable or not, because when they believe that a habit is common to think that joining she found herd protected by the same group that uses its symbols. I do not mean here that this evil have common customs or similar clothing. What is objectionable is as usual habit, especially among young people, to do something only function is fashionable and not their common sense, because in doing so only favor the development of absurd customs. The hippies. It would be desirable to think that the hippies were a peace movement as they normally tend to believe, but the truth is that the movement and the Vietnam War have a direct relationship, because the alleged pacifism attributed to them is nothing more than a rejection reaction to participate in a war that anyway had little social support, because this was not a defensive but clear aggression against a foreign country war, and therefore it was logical that many citizens opposed to risk their lives in that war or accept forced recruitment. The truth is that the hippies were just a bunch of degenerates and promiscuous drug addicts who simply proclaimed themselves pacifists only in order to avoid participating in the war, thus ended once this movement also disappeared. These types of groups or sects are the ideal breeding ground for fraudsters who only seek evil, try to get a role they do not deserve, presented to others as pacifists and say preach the good when they carry within more than selfishness and lust for power. These undesirable sects call it love because what they want is sex and no love, when they are two very different things, can have sex but love is not the same as they would have us believe. Law and justice. Usually it tend to think that law and justice are the same, but such a thing is a mistake because the law should do justice, but it is not always the case, because the law primarily represents the interests of the government that is not always in line with the interests of the citizen. An example of this is in the dry law enacted in the United States in the early 20th century. With the law it was supposed to promote public health but back to the views of citizens. This means that instead of convincing society of the harmful use of alcohol, they chose to threaten and coerce sanctions. This caused a rift between the government and citizens who disregarded this requirement. As a result, there was a great development of mafias and illegal alcohol market. One could say then that the expansion of mafia organizations rather than being merit of them is the consequence of the lack of respect for the rule to civil rights, because in some ways represent the right of society to exercise their free will, and so both these illegal companies were doing justice to offer people what the state forbade them arbitrarily. Therefore in this case the classic definition of who represented good and who represented evil is confusing, because there is no clear answer. The most reasonable thing would have been to create an information campaign to explain the harm that drug use represented while respecting the decision of citizens. In the end the state relented and the dry law was abolished. With this demonstrated that the power of governments cannot do everything, and that although the end is just, cannot be imposed in violation of the freedom of choice of society, because very honorable, so that it does not have to justify the means employed to achieve it, and the duty of governments is to respect the free will of citizens when it comes to deciding on his own life. From that moment the state and citizens came to classify alcohol and drugs, snuff, as good simply because these were the most traditional, and therefore began to persecute the others. This was an act of blatant hypocrisy, because alcohol is the drug that causes more deaths, but to make such a distinction somehow seemed moral. Citizens remain intact, the blame for all the ills to other drugs. The state should end this situation and promote the eradication of drugs, but peacefully and without coercion, for example using measures such as stop considering drunkenness an extenuating circumstance for crimes committed, as now happens in some countries. Since such more measures to help eradicate consumption is what they do favor, it is clear that only when the state and citizens call things by their name this may change. With these measures, the mafia would disappear and many people who are wrongfully imprisoned would come out of it, because if we apply existing laws to all those who peddle drugs, then all owners of bars or factories where it produces or sells alcohol should be in prison. It is true that drugs must be fought, but only in the field of moral education and the elimination of any legal advantage for those who use drugs. Another example of the distance that sometimes exists between law and justice is like some criminal codes establish the right of criminals to obtain compensation for injuries they might suffer during the commission of a crime. In this case the bad faith is evident the law, because its duty is to do everything necessary to discourage the offender to commit crimes and not to encourage it. Because if the argument of the law to justify this measure is that the victim's act of defense had caused injury to the aggressor higher than justified, then it is logical to hold accountable the victim for their excess, but in no case allow an offender can be rewarded for injuries they might suffer during their criminal activity. It is unfortunate that often when a crime, the law, or do nothing or take a position clearly in favor of the offender, just not wanting to take measures involving public spending occurs. Clearly the weakness and neglect in many of the penal codes of these false democracies, because not only refuse to do justice, but in many cases collude with criminals. Decent political. It is a pity to see how the educational system itself is inculcated children who live in a democracy. It seems that what really seeking is to create a society of faithful servants obedient. But how can be considered a democratic system that allows only thing is to elect political leaders, but no option to directly decide the laws that govern us? Clearly what is trying to convince citizens that have a democracy, even knowing that such a thing is false. But the most outrageous of all is that those politicians who call themselves decent, are the same as applaud when a politician thief is pardoned after serving a ridiculous part of his sentence without having returned the stolen. Those politicians who act this may not be considered rather than as accomplices of others to such behavior. As you can believe in the political agenda of those proposing the release of serial murderers or rapists after serving only a fraction of their sentences, and this systematically, they include in their criminal codes the release of criminals in a short time regardless of the seriousness of their crimes. Could it be that identify with them? Clearly, what they do is prepare the penal code when they apply to them. These rascals politicians talk about being humanitarian with criminals, but they refer to patronizing criminals or thieves like them, never do justice to the victims, which they despise, as only they consider them mere funding of their parties. These hypocritical politicians, then say justice has been done. They have served their sentences. But they know that this statement is false because the laws are designed so that impunity is standard. Most politicians call themselves decent, but how many of them are in favor of removing their privileges? They measure with which society must judge put. These rascals' political friends say criminals quickly the jail is for reinserting. But such a statement is false because the prison primarily aims to remove from society those who do not deserve to be in it, and whether the severity of their sentences to life imprisonment determines that the right is met. Always it is reasonable to release in the case of finding evidence of his innocence, but otherwise the priority has to be the victim, not the criminal. Sometimes say criminals have repented. But is there any criminal who does not say repenting immediately after entering prison? These friends of criminals, with whom they identify, they forget that who takes a life of intentional and premeditated need not decide on his own, and if society believes that the fair payment is an example keeping you in prison, then it is entitled to apply. Reinsertion is always desirable, but for criminals who deserve it, but who takes a life cannot expect society to stop thinking about your tastes or if you have repented or not, because for those who have a conviction for centuries that you need not apply. Logically it would correct a reduction of sentence for good behavior, but a reduction is not an annulment, because the crimes are not cancelled, and therefore it is reasonable that such a reduction is a minority percentage of the total, if what is looking for justice. It is also fair prisoners to work because they are not hotels, so they can pay compensation to their victims and expenses which might arise during their stay in prison. These politicians, false democrats, do not hesitate to use the threat to citizens to participate in the electoral system, because there are many countries in which fines those who refuse to collaborate with deceit by refusing to vote or participate in the table's election. They are wrong who think that the system can be changed from within, as if it is a false democratic model. The only solution is to reject and refuse to participate in it, until those in power give the hint, participate in the game parties is to fall into deception. Clearly, when the thief is the one who makes the laws, cannot be expected to do justice. Actually existing political systems are nothing more than a mere imitation of Greek models of the V century BC. Left-wing parties claim to care about workers, but by supporting illegal immigration all they do is promote a slave society like the yellowish Athens. Right-wing parties have no obsession that perpetuate the privileges of the rich slave like Sparta. That game left and right to bring the parties want is nothing but a fiction. The truth is neutral and not subject to any party. The world needs a new way of conceiving democracy, a system by which laws are directly elected by citizens. Only then this kind of political tricksters and thieves can be eradicated from society permanently. Asymmetrical society. Today it is striking to see how society seems to become increasingly important to an asymmetric approach to life. Art, for example, is expressed increasingly through the deformity, incoherence, and absurdity. An example of this is at the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, in which both his supposed works of art, like architecture of the building, all this represents the asymmetry and deformity. This is an example of how a society aimless expresses its definition of art, or what he thinks is art. This is a society without God, but not because God has abandoned them, but because they have turned their back on God. Is not it true perhaps that in nature all things usually follow a symmetrical shape? The roundness of the planets, the shape of our bodies, that symmetry is actually the expression of order and logic, which is one of the factors that connect man with God. But this current society feels omnipotent with technological development, it is believed invincible and no doubt repeat the mistakes of the past. This society forgets people and just think about the mere economic productivity. This society goes increasingly quickly towards a model based on slavery and miscegenation, causing asymmetry and social disunity only by the profit motive of companies. But what is the talk of business growth or high per capita income, if people are unhappy with this situation of miscegenation and crime that causes uncontrolled immigration? The growth is not the only thing that counts, also order and social integration that same culture and race represent, but society does not want to see that this sea beast that is the United States, to do so led to believe, is presented to the world as the great defender of freedom, but its policy is based on imperialism and submission of the world to their interests. This empire, no doubt, when you are interested in supporting dictators or overthrowing only democracies so that their companies can deplete the world's resources, it is only necessary to see the average income of an American and a citizen of Africa to discover their deception. Even within the United States itself, social inequalities are outrageous and successive governments do not do anything about it. Meanwhile, in international politics make propaganda in favor of miscegenation, but only as a strategy to promote world domination. Day after day advertise how bad they were, the Nazis. But only for people not offer resistance to domination they seek to impose, because they are now the new dictators disguised as Democrats. What is the difference between being dominated by the Nazis or by a country of sodomites mestizos? That is what has become the United States. We try to make people believe that this is an ideal situation, but only pursue world domination. This shows that in the world everything is relative and the concept of democracy is no different. The truth is that current political systems are far from real democracy, but do not hesitate to use this as an excuse to justify interference in the affairs of other states, but not in order to promote democracy, but to support their selfish interests, as was done during the Roman Empire. Really is not that the US government supports miscegenation as an end, it just tries to take advantage of his victory against the Nazis, as if they were trying to dominate the world with a racist policy. Then they to get the same need to use policy pro-miscegenation as a way for that citizens do not realize that pursue the same goals of the Nazis, but at the cost of destroying the social order. Words that appear inside and outside its borders support miscegenation, but only to gain time until their goal is submission of the world to their interests. But society increasingly feel more dissatisfied with this situation, but worst of all is that you do not know the remedy, does not understand that the first casualty in war is truth loser, does not understand that the racial question the Nazis were right, and to achieve a developed society this must be based on a stable order, whereby each live in peace and harmony in the world but not mixed race, because each race was made by nature to live in different climates. Society must understand that Being in favor of respect for the rights of all races does not mean you have to support miscegenation, because in fact that miscegenation only serves as a vehicle to bring more disorder and social inequality. But this society aimlessly is just repeating the same mistakes of ancient Rome, to bet on a model of mixed and slave society, now no longer it called slavery, but from a comparative point of view the economic situation of these people far from it. Because the best way to guarantee the rights of each race is that each has a recognized territory, which is not possible interference from other races in their own affairs, thus genuine freedom itself would have. The subhumans. It is surprising to see how these subhuman try to seize power in the world would have us believe that care workers when all they do is agree in the shade with murderers and terrorists, those subhuman seeking partnerships with all the world's dictators to seize power and whose sole political objective is the submission of society to his dictatorship. These populist subhuman would have us believe that communism is a solution when failure is evident even in those countries that developed it. They intended to give us lessons of economy when their only project is the waste of public resources, proposed borrowing as a solution to all problems, but how are you going to go into debt a country that is already in debt? It is that for them the balanced management of the economy has no meaning. Because a model country is one that depends on its own resources, no resources of others, because these guys what actually plan is asking for money and then not return it, and that's a mean-spirited conduct unbecoming of what you can expect from a government. It is true that a country can borrow, but only as part of a low debt situation, because that money will gladly want to ask to return and of course with interest, but this is not populist tell citizens. For an equal government that a person when he is honored, find the solution to their problems arranging their internal imbalances without trying to convey their problems to others through borrowing, as this solution can only be exceptional but never a way of life, because it is only fair that a nation depends on what it produces and not what others produce. It is therefore necessary to review those things that are wrong in the economy to work depending on their own resources, particularly avoiding unnecessary corruption and wastefulness. An example of this is in the present public health fraud. It is not the same earmark money to care for the sick to make sure that money really goes to the purpose for which it was intended, since in many cases is lost in an unjustified overvaluation of treatments, or the monopoly of the intermediaries involved in healthcare. This is a health system too interested in buying drugs, but little interested in curing diseases. They intended to propose themselves as a substitute for religion when he has never been a nation where the political model has benefited its citizens, rely on populist statements claiming seek the good of the workers but only covet the power to create a dictatorship. They destroy everything they touch because all that is in their intentions is selfishness. Because there is no more despicable than robbing a poor thing, and that is precisely what they do. These individuals claim to be concerned about human rights, but at the same time calling for serial murderers sentenced to life imprisonment meet only a fraction of their sentences. It is clear that when they speak of rights do not relate to the victims. It is true that a developed nation is characterized by caring for all its citizens, including those who are in a disadvantaged situation, but these populist what they want is not help but use that argument as an excuse to seize power at the same time they are destroying their own country. For an economy progresses is one that rewards work and not vagrancy, and therefore it is essential that as much as possible contributory aid are returned to the state by citizens, by creating a work program. It is also true that trying to recover an economy by reducing wages is a ridiculous solution and especially highlights the lack of talent of the political class, because reducing the salaries of those who earn the least causing a contraction economy, considering that those with the lowest wages generally spend everything they earn, and therefore this measure can only lead to a reduction in business. Therefore, the best remedy for an economy to function is to assume without fear of an economic model that rewards work instead excessively in favor of grants, and therefore the economy is more oriented towards full employment to dependence state. Because when an economy tends to solve everything with subsidies, such as work absences are covered by paying workers less, missing in the end what occurs is an injustice to them. It is not that the system cannot create insurance to cover such absences, which does not make sense, is that the emphasis is on those most work. Therefore, the perfect social model is one that helps those in need, but demanding also lose your part and responsibility for work absences are shared equally between the company and the worker in order that this is not used as a pretext for laziness or lack of work unjustified. Therefore a perfect economy is one that rewards work, but at the same time helping those in need by requiring an effort to change, to return the favor received. Because an economy can only be competitive when he is grateful to those who strive to develop, otherwise only leads to unemployment and lack of competitiveness, because in the end who end up paying these efforts really are the same workers holding companies. It is also essential to fight corruption, fomented by the politicians themselves, but that will not end until the penal code to be modified and the political class no longer get away with judicial proceedings in which it is processed. The problem is that when the thief it is the law that makes it very difficult to solve. The last war. The world is getting closer to his last battle, but not a war between nations but a battle between good and evil, light and darkness, ignorance and knowledge, a war that is not done with tanks and rifles but exists within each person, because the moral development is really the last stage in the process of evolution of humanity. That process has been delayed continuously by the fact that the philosophical progress is at odds with economic progress. As to make possible their development is necessary to have time, have privacy to meditate, because it is through meditation as it progresses philosophy, and the deeper the highest concentration is the usefulness of the results. But human life through history has been a continuous struggle for survival that has left very little opportunity to develop inner awareness, but that awareness is what differentiates an evolved another that is not. Arguably philosophy is food for the spirit, and who thinks he can live without principles is wrong, as are those principles that help us relate to the universe in a fruitful way. So the man of the future consider his inner development as its greatest value, and the defense of right and justice as the core of their behavior. Chapter 3, Science. The authentic art. Today we see anything called art, it seems that people have lost the ability to distinguish what is beautiful from what is not, are not able to understand that true art it is the result of effort and sacrifice and not the trivial whims, because art arises when something is created in harmony with nature, something that has a logic and a result. Because there is much more art in the design of an engine or the architecture of a building, which in those vulgar drawings what they call abstract art. People are not able to understand that those who call themselves artists are but a redoubt of vague and pretentious that generally lack talent, because before any criticism they simply say, I just do not understand my art. It's that you are ignorant. But would have to see if those artists call themselves are able to do something that requires talent as an old portrait or engineering design, sure to fail, because it is easier to give a few strokes on a canvas and then call it art, do something that requires difficulty. This is not to say that it can make sense to abstract art, but when it is not based on absurd drawings, because its true meaning is to use recognizable symbolic figures but in situations other than its normal form, i.e. they are able to suggest something more important and logical to observe it, but that requires talent and know how to draw something that impostors would find it impossible to get. But the worst part is that this present society, which is believed so developed, something as basic as this will be difficult to understand. We live in a society without order or moral society whose God is the only commodity production, so it is logical that this band is capable of developing impostors. It is regrettable that when those individuals who call themselves artists of the abstract are promoted by an art gallery, become treated as being deified and their absurd drawings are seeking twisted justifications and cultural value undeserving and everything in order to promote the gallery and get money. Citizens should not easily accept the arguments of those false artists, because in this present degenerate society all are selfish interests and needs an objective analysis to arrive at the truth and not be easily carried away by the means or beliefs of the masses can be manipulated easily. Only in a society without order or moral existence of such impostors, it explained, because when a world lacks direction is very difficult to produce true artists, therefore it tends to elevate those undesirable and fiction is created that their works are just great because they want to look in the mirror and understand the decadent world in which they live. People should ask who and why they are interested in promoting an art without direction or sense, perhaps deep fear that society wake up and demand the changes that they are not interested. The Flood. The legend of the Great Flood is present in many cultures. This belief may have its origin in the events that occurred after the end of the last glaciation occurred about 12,000 years ago. At that time much of the Earth's surface was covered by ice. This caused the sea level was tens of meters lower than today. In those days the main centers of civilization were located in desert areas today, but in those days had extensive vegetation, mainly in the regions of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The beginning of the thaw caused a growing flood in the river beds and an elevation in the level of the coast. This in the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers it must have caused major flooding. Climate change not only occurred in that region, because everyone was affected. The channel had a layer of ice that connected France with England. Defrost the sea penetrated and definitely separated. Many large islands were reduced to insignificant islets. But where it could be the most dramatic change is in the Mediterranean area, because the increased sea level this penetrated from the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar, flooding throughout the region. Increasing the Earth's temperature turned what was once a green oasis in a desert regions like the Sahara in Egypt and Mesopotamia, gradually changing the sphere of political power in Africa and the Middle East to Europe. Probably the events in ancient times as a result of the end of glaciation were passed in the ancient stories like a great flood. The mistakenly believed it was caused by rain and not by the melting of large amounts of water. The evolution of Homo sapiens. Formerly, some 30,000 years ago, Europe was covered by ice of the last glaciation. Because of this, continent was practically deserted but inhabited by Neanderthals. Meanwhile, Africa at that time enjoyed a much more pleasant climate similar to today's Mediterranean climate. This situation caused the Homo sapiens settled in Africa had a long time and an ideal climate to evolve. As the global temperature increased, Homo sapiens began moving to Europe and was replacing the Neanderthals. Did not it was a necessarily violent replacement, because being the Homo superior sapiens was evolutionarily able to extract food from the best environment that man Neanderthal. Some cases of interbreeding between the two species were also given, but the result was a human version less than Homo sapiens. Eventually this version was disappearing as the superior genes were predominating over the lower. However, at present a small number of genes of Neanderthals are still preserved in the Homo sapiens, probably because they are responsible for the adaptation to cold European climate, although it is also true that the crossing does not occur. These genes were acquired, just a process of natural evolution. In any case, the migration of Homo sapiens to the north was not the result of adaptation to Europe, but Europe adapts to it, because the cause of this was that the European climate was becoming warmer and therefore more like him who had the Homo sapiens in Africa. This shows that living in an ideal climate favoring racial improvement, but currently this is an issue that cannot talk unless it is to deny it, but not scientific but political reasons. Therefore, I find despicable those who accept the existence in the past of species with different levels of development, but at the same time deny the possibility that there may be better breeds than others today, because given the time to crossbreeding in which we live since the end of World War II, is clear that although these tests are known, certainly will not be announced. The reality is that there are no single species or races better than others, but even within the same race can be found these differences. Proof of this is the different amount of body hair that people have, because although most people have little, however there are exceptions to this rule. The explanation is simple and is that since humans started wearing clothes, body hair began to disappear to produce better human version. Eventually people with long hair certainly disappear, but not because nothing is done against them, but the selection process that nature has been doing for thousands of years. This is an example of the difference in the genetic quality of people, but the most striking of all is the most beautiful of European race over the other. This may be obvious, but it will certainly be rejected by many, but not because they have reasons for it, but because when prejudices are conditioning our mind, then people will be able to call night to day and day to night so not to recognize the obvious. What we call races is nothing but an accumulation of large enough genetic differences to be differentiable, but each person is the sum of thousands of different genes, a more evolved and more primitive. Therefore the progress of the genetics is not only that may arise from the differences that may exist between different races, but above all for the gradual elimination of backward diseased genes, or carried out by natural selection itself, or also by the action of human science. Actually, it is as if each person were a race miniature with a different genetic load due to natural selection. In the end, only the best versions prevail, and that will cause future physical differences or character are less than now. Because although we do not realize our body, there are early genes that are in the process of disappearing, and each new generation are less present in the world. However, there are other superior genes that are in the process of expansion. This process can take thousands of years and causes the appearance of better people. The truth is that progress has been in balance, and the white race is found in the part of the earth with the most balanced climate. Therefore, for the story was the most evolved of all. Living in an ideal climate not only favors the appearance of a more beautiful race but also more spiritual, because the extreme heat hinders the development of these dimensional aspects. It is also important to remember that civilization was moving from south to north along the story exactly as did the weather, i.e. when these civilizations existed, both race and the climate that there were, they were more like the European today than they have right now. In fact, chances are that in those days blacks did not exist, as a result of the low temperatures that the earth was due to glaciation. The truth is that the policy of pro-miscegenation is from an evolutionary point of view a serious mistake, because as communism gives priority to quantity over quality. The New Year. Since ancient times, all civilizations tried to measure time, and it realized the usefulness of using the solstices to measure the seasons and the passing years. Then they began to make buildings such as Stonehenge to determine the largest solar inclination and thus to fix at this time the beginning of the year, because there is only one winter or summer solstice each year. It would therefore be desirable for the year again start with the winter solstice on December 22nd, when starting in antiquity, because it makes sense as understood by the old. The new year begins at the moment when the sun begins to rise and the days are getting longer. Doing so would be the most natural way to classify the years. Was actually the Catholic Church that envy of the festival is traditionally celebrated at that time. He decided to set the birth of Jesus just a few days later, on December 25, with malicious order to wrest this party its true meaning. Indeed, the Catholic Church is completely unaware of the actual date of Jesus' birth or even the year, so its bad faith in this regard is clear, and there was this his only invention, because in reality everything related to childhood Jesus and subsequent stories about his miracles were invented. Such falsehoods not we owe attributed to Jesus, for we must not forget that the Catholic Church was not founded by him but by the Roman Empire as a last resort to prevent its collapse. Therefore, it is good that society recover the winter solstice as the date to establish the beginning of the year and thus getting back tune with nature. In addition, institutions should review the history and unmask the falsehoods propagated by religious organizations, because we cannot accept that simple hypotheses are proposed citizens as unquestionable truths. Order in the couple. In any organized system there needs to be clear leadership to make possible the order in marriage. This is equally important, because both spouses are two people with two ways of thinking different, so it is necessary to establish a control command by which it is possible to stabilize the couple. In my opinion, this function is better than exercising man, because if we look at nature, this is how the sun works in the animal world, also in the cosmos, as a male element exerts the presidential function in the solar system to be at the center and coordinate the other planets. Furthermore, as regards the human being is and has traditionally been throughout history, and although it is true that in the past have done wrong things, it would be unfair to say that they have only suffered by women because evolution was difficult for everyone. Therefore, I consider it logical that the man who holds the office of president that gives meaning to the family. This in any case have to be confused with a dictatorship, for man must only perform the function of commanding a democratic manner, without imposing his will, i.e. its leadership role should be only administrative, taking into account the views of others and be fair and benevolent in its deliberations. Of course, the right of withdrawal must always be recognized for both, because as I said, the leadership of the husband in no case should be a dictatorship. It is also true that the fact that the man holds the office of president of the family does not prevent it from having some obligations to them, and therefore does not meet its commitments would be fair to him reproach for it, because the duty of man it is to lead the marriage but only to serve you. It is necessary that each spouse understand that each gender was made by nature to specialize in different functions, therefore need not wonder that these functions are also different in marriage, but it is also true that such specialization does not have to prevent right of both spouses to be equally happy. For this reason the law also has to act accordingly, and in case of separation recognize both spouses' equal right to care for their children, except that they can demonstrate a clear guilt of one, i.e. that both spouses they could live with their children the same time until they were older or share the common housing in equal time periods. In order to obtain the vote for women in some countries, politicians raised family relationships only as feminist topics, so felt that the fault was always the man in case of separation, or were denied custody of their children, saying I could not serve them well. Injustice to establish that virtually all the goods of marriage happen to women, is the floor, children, and even an important part of the salary husband was so committed, this made the separation in a lynching, but with the backing of law, forgetting their duty to be fair and impartial and condemning the man to misery. This type of laws, rather than regulate the separation, they do is induce her, by clearly privileging one spouse. It is assumed that the man was rich and therefore able to dispose of their property without suffering no consequence. The truth is that because of feminism many women are not ready for marriage, because since childhood has taught them that their duty is to confront men in the workplace instead of serving as mothers, so motherhood poses as a hindrance in carrying out such topics, and in many cases only come to have a child, which is totally insufficient for generational change. Thus feminism becomes a real threat to bring society to its own destruction. Political feminist proposed by immigration as a solution, but that does not stop the problem, is the lack of birth, and is only half a solution by shifting the problem to others. In addition, this measure caused a genuine racial and cultural disorder, turning the working class as a social group of partial slavery, because the massive influx of immigrants causes the lowering of the minimum wage. I do not mean by this that women cannot enter the labor market, but it would be logical that first fulfill their duty as mothers, ensuring generational change, and from there can be made in other activities. But most surprising is to see how feminists intend to raise as illogical the fact that women are the ones that should be responsible primarily for the care of children, especially in childhood, because if we look at the example of how the animals care for their young, can see how it is the females who usually deal with their offspring in a more direct way. Does that mean then that all animals are sexist? In humans adjectives like sexism or feminism are used, but it would be stupid to apply such epithets to animals, as these are much more conditioned by nature in their behavior than we, because if anyone should be accused of macho would have to be nature itself or God and not animals. But if the question to consider is who has more wisdom, whether feminists or nature, I am inclined to the second, for it is nature that decided through evolution separate the animals into sexes, and it was nature that determined that were women who will become pregnant and suckle their children, not men. This is because he felt it was better gender specialization and separation of functions that have no advantage of one over the other but for the good of all. So, how wrong it is considered that the separation in different functions equals one underestimation of women, for this separation in no way entitles the mistreatment of one sex over the other, as both have the same obligation to respect and cooperate in the development family, and both have the same right to be happy. At the end gives the impression that many of these feminist movements actually are led by unfeminine women but with great ambition for power, which is actually what they are trying, is to use the other women to not know what they really want. It is to live a life of men, but not because it is good for women but because they do not feel women. The bipolarity of the cosmos. Arguably the cosmos, most things have a positive or negative, which should not be confused with good or bad, as both are benign. This bipolarity is born with the nature of the cosmos. Polar defined as essentially began with that the subject is the opposite of vacuum and vacuum is the opposite of the art. Both are the same but in reverse, since it cannot exist without the other, since the vacuum without matter could no comparison, because the vacuum is nothingness. Matter represents the existence and non-existence, and void both exist outside of time because the universal laws are the same as always. The time change represents the evolutionary movement of matter but within those laws. Consequently arise calls polarities arising, for example the sexes or the magnetic poles, but as immense amount of things that are defined polar form. In the universe the two polarities are equally important, but that does not mean that it fulfilled the same functions. So lamentable is the current confrontation between the sexes, because it is not understood that the fact that both are equally necessary does not mean that they have to do the same things. Values are men. The sun relative to the earth, salt, heat, red, the galactic core, circle, power, government, the crest in a sling, the pleasure derived from the technique, the positive magnetic pole, the day, the vertical line, the minority, the exception, the numbers 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, and 8. Feminine values are the planets from the sun, the stars about the galactic core, sugar, philosophy, cold, blue, square, night, the valley in a sling, the horizontal line, water, sea, the negative magnetic pole, the majority, the numbers 0, 3, 6, and 9. There are actually male or female values in all. This is not a contradiction, the key is expressed in different planes. Good and evil. Good. It represents good light, white, justice, truth, intelligence, wisdom, knowledge, right, progress, above. Evil. Evil represents ignorance, darkness, error, down the mistake, the black color. Do not confuse the positive or negative values in the cosmos in most things good and evil, for positive or negative values are all benign and necessary, while misrepresents what is unacceptable and wrong. Good and evil have in common with the values that have polarity that are opposites like them, but unlike them it does not mean that both are desirable, because in fact evil only represents that which is never desirable and therefore something that we should stay away. Good then represents the right and acceptable, wrong and wrong are opposite each other, but only one represents what makes sense to do. Actually, evil could be defined as the percentage of accidents is inevitable in the evolution of the cosmos, for it has no sense to look for evil intended, therefore who adhere to sects based on evil, it is as if identified with ignorance, stupidity, or would delay those arising evil objective end up being unhappy, then lie in an unstable position who becomes antisocial and unable to relate to others in a balanced way. Evil is the result of the inevitable return of the cosmos to the ignorance that is derived from its restart. The same universe that people also have to die to be renewable, with this renewal comes forgetfulness and oblivion comes the error, but also the shock of the new, yet the suffering caused the error is not a goal in itself but it is a necessary evil if the universe wants to renew. Why are mistaken who think that evil is desirable as good, for what the universe needs is to start again and forget to be renewable, but evil is not more than the suffering caused by the error, the result of that renewal. Evil is not a goal in itself, what is needed is to renew the cosmos and return to ignorance to be able to recycle. Evil is undesirable consequence of this renewal and therefore all the effort of progress is based on the fight to avoid the mistake that makes us suffer and represents evil, a constant struggle from darkness into light. Evil is the error, and obviously no one wants to be wrong, however renew the universe needs to be able to forget, and it is because of forgetfulness as ignorance, error, and evil arises. Evil in human behavior stems from a mistaken view of reality, so those who so behave believe that a permanent attitude of confrontation with their peers they will serve useful, but such a thing is an error-derived get carried away a petty and despotic approach to things, but that makes them unhappy who so behave, because it is wrong and unbalanced behavior. It is necessary to understand that in human relations good and peaceful coexistence must be the cornerstone's behavior in order to be happy. One of the possible explanations of evil in human behavior would be a deviation in the natural aggressiveness caused by excessive consent from parents on the whims of their children. This causes children to believe they can do whatever they want without caring the consequences. This attitude eventually results in a mean-spirited behavior as a common pattern in adulthood is very difficult to correct. Children need to learn that their rights end where they begin those of others, therefore it is essential to teach moral values from the childhood. The universe when it restarts again ignorance of the error drift and error derives evil, but that does not mean that evil is the goal of cosmic renewal but rather an inevitable consequence. Therefore from the same time the cosmos begins to evolve the effort of every living creature is to progress from darkness to light and from ignorance to knowledge. Therefore the universe to renew and forget not looking for evil, but again reliving the same emotions as if for the first time. For this reason those worlds that reach a high level of evolution definitively banish evil represented by vanity and ignorance. The black and white color. As I said, these colors are benign and necessary essence, however they can also represent good or evil, but secondary. These colors can represent both masculine values such as female depending on the plane in which they are. White color. White represents the horizontal line in planes and vertical in others, also the truth, goodness, justice, the day, progress, white light, sugar, intelligence, philosophy, above the divine, the backbone of the universe, universal laws, most in some planes represents the masculine and other feminine. The color black. The black color represents the night, seriousness, in a deep valley, rest, renewal, minority, sometimes evil, error or ignorance in some planes represents the feminine and the masculine other. It is clear then that the existence of positive and negative values in the cosmos are both equally necessary and benign and should not be confused with the evil of the error, and is only the result of the renewal of the cosmos. It is true that to give rise to this renewal is also provided that evil appears, but is not a goal in itself, but an inevitable consequence. Renewed and re-ignorance is necessary when the universe has aged, it allows live again emotions as if they were new, the suffering caused by the error and represents evil as just the price to pay for this renewal. For this reason all evolved society must have the right and justice as fundamental philosophical principles. The total justice and exceptions. In principle, any evolved society needs a code of moral values to establish justice as principal rule of conduct. Otherwise it would be impossible to create a stable social order. In my opinion, ideally defend the full justice as the only way to raise the moral behavior. Full justice means the fair and without exception as the only acceptable behavior. However, it is also possible to believe in an approach to fair behavior admitting exceptions. This is the reason for writing this article, that is trying to give a logical sense to define it as in the case of sense. First, let me say that admitted the possibility of considering unfair behaviors as valid only makes sense if raised as exceptional, meaning that although it is believed that both justice and injustice are necessary or justifiable to be considered as part of a set of different polarities but equally important, however should be expressed in different dimensions or planes but organized as majority and minority. That is, that justice should be raised as the norm of behavior and injustice as the exception. In this sense, the right behavior should be normal moral form present in the human mind, as both dimensions must always be separated. Be ambiguous about can only cause harm to those who confuse it, i.e. the pursuit of good and justice should be the main driver of behavior, and possible unfair behaviors they appear only casually and indirectly. This means that even considering to justice and injustice as two equal and necessary forces in a generic sense not behave in practice, it would be distributed as if in them a force of gravity that would separate distributed in the form of majority is applied and minority. This does not mean underestimating the minority force, as a relative size is not the same as an absolute value. We can find in the cosmos examples to prove, such as the distribution of the solar system. In this case the Sun represents the accepted as in the center of the system and the different star of others, and planets represent the norm because they are more numerous. Yet the Sun, still being only one and different, is so important in organizing the solar system. As planets it is larger and more massive than all the planets together and is the source of energy in the cosmos. Another example is how the political system is distributed in an organized society. In this case government members represent the exception and all other citizens the norm, but the exception in this case is who runs the state, but always in direct connection with society. This shows that the separation of the majority and minority dimensions need not be interpreted as an underestimation of the concept of minority. It could be said that the key would be in the potential, meaning that although the right behavior should be the protagonist of our lives in terms of our habitual behavior, exceptional cases of injustice would have greater importance, may be associated frequently political or economic power. This does not mean that those in power have to be necessarily unfair, but the power it easy. Arguably from a symbolic point of view, that injustice is like the Sun, something exceptional in energy but separate from the norm and stability represented by justice and planets, therefore whoever touches can burn. To avoid unpleasant consequences need not play with this issue and uphold justice as the norm of our usual moral conduct, and that basically every action has a consequence, and who questions the rights of others you risk the reaction it represents, the self-defense. In this case the Sun is expressed in a vertical and minority and symbolized by the red plane. could also represent injustice or central government. The planets, in this case the horizontal line, represent good and white. We must differentiate in this case the injustice of tyranny. Injustice would be represented by the color red, and from this point of view it would make sense sometimes exceptionally. Tyranny instead would be represented by the black color and would always be rejected because it is a variant of injustice but out of place and sense. This means that evil could be said to injustice when it abandons its balanced attitude to become the norm of habitual behavior is what makes tyranny. It could also be defined as a disease of the spirit when it loses the notion of reality and therefore is always wrong and reprehensible behavior. Needless to say, black in this case has a negative meaning, but this does not have to be necessarily so, because the colors are essentially benign and malignant approach depends on the circumstances, since in the background evil and tyranny they are the result of ignorance, and this is precisely one of the meanings of black color, i.e. it is the inability to see the white light of truth and knowledge. Although the wrongful conduct might make sense sometimes, you never should be sought routinely, because it is logical that alone is something exceptional and would not be the dominant element in our mind. Precisely what is defined as demon is when someone ignores this and becomes evil in its raison d'etre. This alone can hurt him, because he becomes incapable antisocial relate to anyone except those degenerate like him. It is therefore necessary to teach moral behavior from children to understand the consequences of antisocial behavior it can have. Another way to explain why justice should be the moral principle of conduct is that from an energy standpoint justice represents the horizontal and stable line, while injustice would be energetically unstable vertical line. For this reason a healthy and safe life is to consider taking justice as a way of normal behavior. As I said, definitions of vertical and horizontal planes are not fixed, and in other circumstances justice is expressed vertically as the backbone of the universe, and representing the divine, the truth, and the white light. As I said, the fact define evil black or injustice red does not mean that therefore these colors should be considered negative, as these interpretations are only one of the secondary variants that may be associated these colors. Since all colors are benign, essentially the same can be said with respect to numbers. So it could be said that although justice and injustice were considered as two acceptable forces in generic terms, the perfect balance in human behavior only finds separating these concepts into one majority and a minority. Being therefore just conduct the normal way of our being, and just having this clear our minds can find your balance. To explain more clearly the theory of the exceptions of justice would arguably be a square scheme X in which the lines would go from top left to bottom right and from top right to bottom left. On the right triangle and white justice would be found, and the left and red triangle injustice would be found. This would represent the absolute generic values, but in practice justice occupy most of the horizontal surface and injustice minimal but with more height because they are expressed in the form of majority and minority. Arguably is as two schemes, one square with an X in the center, are expressed only the absolute values, in the other rectangular, or also oval as the shape of a galaxy. The way in which it is normally expressed as percentages does so by majority and minority shown. However, when we refer to the ratio between good and bad it would be the same approach, but in this case the scheme would be rotated, reaching the wrong black on the bottom and the fine white on top. In this case is different because unlike evil, injustice would always be rejected without exception, being a wrong behavior. Therefore in the case of logic, considering the theory of justice exceptions, it should be raised as the usual moral norm. The possible exceptions would exceptionally and evil, as we have always said, it would be rejected. It can be said then that although the right and wrong have equal absolute values, in practice be distributed in completely different and separate planes, defined in this case injustice in a vertical plane and justice in a horizontal plane, but depend on the circumstances, as the case may occur in reverse, because if we change the dimensional plane and turn the above scheme, placing injustice as horizontal element and justice as vertical element, passed to the plane of good and evil, in this case the fine would be located above, symbolizing white light and progress, and evil would be located below, representing the black color and ignorance. In this case the evil would always be objectionable because it represents the suffering caused by the error. However, the universe needs to continuously recycled, and one consequence of this is again ignorance is not ignorance and suffering caused by it they are a goal in itself, but rather an unavoidable evil. This means that although exceptions justice were deemed acceptable, however would always be objectionable petty and despotic behavior, true expression of evil, because these behaviors are always harmful to those who use them, for evil represents the deviation of justice. Exceptions to the vanity and tyranny, leaving the moderate attitude is always a mistake, so it is always reprehensible without exception. The true meaning of the phrase, selling his soul to the devil, is that when someone comes to a miserly attitude, thinking about profit ends up losing more than winning, because evil is in itself a wrong action, because it represents the abandonment by the spirit of the necessary attitude of moderation that is necessary for life. People who act like they never feel happy about many things that have, because happiness does not depend solely on the goods, but the attitude one have towards life. Therefore, in the case considered, certain exceptions theory of justice would be best to teach children philosophy of justice as fundamental without more, because trying to explain the exceptions too soon could lead to unnecessary errors. This means that evolved worlds could be given justified cases of injustice as those related to the advantages of power or compensation of salaries, but disappear completely petty behavior as tyranny, vanity, or despotism, which are the true expressions of evil. This means that the exceptions of justice only exist legally, linked mainly to the business benefits but not criminal behavior. The good is light, and light is knowledge and progress. It is therefore necessary that the meaning of life is always to good, although sometimes could be considered justified inequitable conduct, because evil and injustice not are exactly the same. Evil is not something that the universe needs, it is rather the price you have to pay for recycled and returned to ignorance, because it is derived from it, but ignorance is the result of regenerating and reliving universal life again. In this case we have analyzed how would a philosophy of moral attitude considered justified admit exceptions just conduct necessary for coexistence. However, since it is true that most life issues exceptions are considered logical, according to this rule could also be considered logical to admit in this case an exception and consider that justice must be total, and if exceptions could not be considered as a contradiction to the necessary search of moderate balance and intermediate usually is the most right, because in this case would be considered unjust acts always wrong and reprehensible and therefore outside the rules of the exceptional use of things. In the universe all things are possible have to be acceptable, even as an exception. It all depends on that makes sense, so the path of progress can only be one, evolve from darkness and ignorance representing evil toward the light that represents knowledge and justice. Philosophy in favor of full justice also has its complexity, as it is to consider as true the assumption of eternal life of the spirit and the repetition of the cosmos indefinitely until all beings live through reincarnation all possible lives, i.e. that time would be repeated but in each new repetition would live a different role from the previous cosmic cycle. Then it would no longer felt to be unfair to others, living oneself one day those same lives. Moreover, in the case of make sense exceptions theory of justice would not be to question this, but considering that these future assumptions would not be important enough to alter the present circumstances. However, although in the future the full justice as the best option is considered, the theory of exceptions justice will always serve to explain the way in primitive worlds its relationship with justice arising from a moral point of view. It is the way that people usually behave, perhaps not understanding the eternal and cyclical nature of the cosmos. In any case, my opinion is that full justice is best, because when the mind is engaged only live justly, potential concentration is greater by not having to worry about the consequences of your actions and consequently the results of life they are better. Pyramid of knowledge. Arguably the scale ideal values would be like a pyramid that would justice located at its highest point, i.e. all moral values that have to conform our mind. This would be the most important because it is essential to create a society organized, i.e. the defense of peace and justice would be the essential value but not the only, because only represent a fraction of the total sum of the values required, but it would be the most important and the coordinator of all element. Although it is difficult to determine what values would be more important, could be seen as defending the race would be second, because it is through the race as evolution has given to us the progress of the genes. Nature determined that each climate corresponded him a race and thus defend the existence of all of them without mixing is a moral obligation. The order should happen to chaos so that there is progress, and miscegenation only involves disorder. Only the best climate of the earth can produce the best and most beautiful race is the white race. All races have the right to exist and to be free, but it is our duty to reject the abomination of miscegenation represents the lack of progress on this. Today on miscegenation is being used as an imperialist weapon primarily by the United States, for failing to recognize racial boundaries, believed in the right to invade and interfere in the internal affairs of other races, try to obtain a material benefit from his victory, militate against the Germans in the Second World War, but keep in mind that what we fought in that war were nations, not ideas. It is therefore a serious mistake to believe that the fact that the Germans lost the war implying that have to be wrong at all. At present there are only material interests in this matter. It is striking to note that before the war always was considered as a depraved conduct and tawdry favor miscegenation, and instead now supported, but only with military and political purposes, and is clearly the power to dignity takes precedence. Third on the order of values could put birth control, because it is absolutely necessary that every country has the number of inhabitants that their economy is able to sustain. It is fallacious to pretend trivialize this matter, as do NGOs, to affirm that developed countries should maintain free population growth in underdeveloped, because without effective birth control will never solve the problem of hunger. But NGOs do not pursue combat hunger, because the poor are their business and source of income. More could be considered as parasitic of them as their allies, and for this reason they do nothing to make poverty disappear, only propose get more food, even knowing that without a birth control this will lead to more poverty. If we really to worry of the poor is in birth control, which would put their effort, that do not do, shows where impostors are. Fourth on the scale, ideal values would defend social justice, meaning that in a world evolved in which there was a fixed number of inhabitants, the law should ensure that all inhabitants had secured a job and housing upon reaching adulthood. Thus the lives of many young people as it is today is not wasted. This is only possible when governments assume by law birth control, determining that each couple can have only 2 children maximum, and in some cases 3 when circumstances permit. In this way every child from birth would have secured a job, and housing would be given to him by the state in the form of rent for life upon reaching the age of majority. In any case, while it reaches, the state should guarantee every citizen unemployed the right to a subsidy minimum survival, although more than minimal subsidies would be fair that there were minimal work in exchange for subsidies, thus bums and parasites social work who could not benefit from them. Fifth place could stand to defend real democracy, which is the authentic expression of justice in the political arena, and not the false that there is now, but a system in which the laws were elected directly and individually by all citizens, but that does not interest the current politicians, who are only interested in allowing the election of leaders and parties in order to ensure their privileges. Stiff the universe. Many people wonder, far came the conquests of science, or anything you can imagine is possible. In my opinion, the achievements that are possible through science arguably represent half between everything and nothing, i.e. that the process of evolution of the cosmos possible is necessary, that this has some strong laws and unmovable which will serve as a starting point and a framework for development of subsequent options. From the existence of this group of unremovable basic laws would be the existence of a large number of variables options, i.e. we could find many differences in the universe, but whenever they were not in contradiction with the basic laws, because absent such laws the universe would be meaningless and would not be possible to build an organized cosmos. So to the question that you may get in the process of universal evolution, the answer is that everything that does not contradict the primary basic laws, which could also be called laws of nature or God. It is as if the universe had 2 basic dimensions in relation to its laws, and other elastic, rigid, vertical and horizontal. Vertical be stable, that determine the pace of progress, and universal horizontal would be those that are subject to our personal tastes. It should be borne in mind that universal laws are not owned by anyone, nor give anyone the ability to exercise control over others exclusively or indefinitely, because these laws are simply the consequence of the essential and inescapable truth that all beings must submit equally, and in the development of these laws sometimes we all participate more directly and sometimes not, but no one can be considered owner of them. From here the question is, so what are these primordial laws? The answer is simple: these laws exist and are in touch with them constantly, but how difficult is to be sure of what and what not, what are the true cosmic values and what false, because nature allows us to choose between different options, but if wrong we suffer the consequences when colliding with these cosmic laws that are necessary for the universe works. Therefore we must seek the truth and not be obsessed with topical or preconceived ideas, it is necessary to doubt everything and reason all matters including the most deeply rooted religious beliefs, and not because those beliefs are why be wrong, but by the fact that they may be. When a man stands something that makes sense but because a religious leader said the resignation antiquity to their own will and his judgment. Not forget that although the religious leader had good intentions does not guarantee that their beliefs are true at all. The affirmation as used by religious organizations is a divine being and therefore infallible is only a presumption and not a test, and is used by them as a form of coercion to acquire power, trying to impede the ability of analysis and discussion of citizens. Therefore, we must use the capacity that nature gives us to seek the truth, doubting religious topics in order to improve them, but not because they believe that those beliefs are in their false essence, but to correct their mistakes and adapt a more evolved society. Circles of evolution. It could be defined evolution as a series of circles placed one inside the other. The inner circles represent the earlier stages of evolution and outer circles the most advanced in this phase. Around each circle a series of points that actually represent the keys necessary to overcome each circle would meet. It could be said that evolution would be a line starting in the center and continue through each circle, passing through each point of knowledge. Once each circle completed, a jump to the next level would then beginning to go the next circle. These theoretical assumptions can be experienced frequently in daily life to be necessary to discover numerous keys and simple principle to make a major breakthrough to pass at a different level of knowledge. Another example would be the tectonics, because first a gradual accumulation of stress on the plates ending in an abrupt and sudden displacement in the form of earthquake, or the slow process of accumulation of scientific knowledge in the last 10,000 years occurs that he ended in a sudden evolutionary leap in the 20th century and still continues. It is that evolution is the way through a circle or evolutionary level that is necessary to discover all the characteristics of that circle keys to move to the next. The process of discovering knowledge point around the circle is slow, but once the journey of discovery of the keys over the jump to the next level occurs suddenly and quick to join the momentum that gives knowledge of all keys that circle, you can say then that evolution is not something that occurs slowly or quickly, but most of the time evolves slowly, but once the root of each level of knowledge over a sharp jump occurs and quick to reach the next level of evolution. Once the world reach full self-realization at the technological level will return to a slow pace of change similar to ancient times, but without losing the achievements, then rapid progress is no longer necessary because mankind will have everything you might need. Chapter 4, Philosophia. The devil does not exist. What is the true definition of the devil? In my opinion, is the wrong course of action that leads to suffering. Can you then say that the devil is not a living being? Not necessarily, because when a person becomes evil in its raison d'être, then it gives life to the devil by himself. When vanity becomes the determining factor in how to be a person, at that moment it is like the devil incarnate who lives through it. Then it is not about any kind of possession as normally understood, but a psychological issue. It is the consequence of having oriented the wrong side. Therefore, the proper way to expel the demon is simply to teach the consequence of their actions to the person who commits sins by teaching or punishment provided. So what are the exorcisms? In my opinion, the so-called possession as understood in a common way may have several explanations. On the one hand, may be the result of the attempt by a spirit of someone dead to return to life, trying to steal the body of one who had put contact him through methods like Ouija or similar table. In this case, and in order to avoid expulsion, spirit intruder represent the role of a supposed demon when questioned, respond in line with the preconception that it had those who perform the exorcism. The so-called ability to speak in tongues would be one of the qualities of mind, but for those who accept life before birth and after death this would not be so strange. Just at birth memory spirit is deactivated so as not interfere with the new plane of existence. It is also possible to confuse mere emotional disorders with alleged possession of an evil spirit. In this case it may be that the person subjected to exorcism is limited to playing the role of an alleged possession in a mental state that would be more correct to define as hypnotic suggestion-induced exorcist. No doubt that an organization like the Catholic Church, full of scandals for their wicked behavior both past and present, find it extremely beneficial to appear before the world as alleged saviors of the exorcised people. It's like he asked a demon who would save someone from the possession of another. Although it is also true that no one is evil absolutely. In any case, I do not think it ever existed or ever will exist a real possession. If we understand how such a spirit steal the body someone, what if it happens is the attempt by some spirits for stealing the body to those considered most vulnerable. However, this is impossible by the strong natural link between the spirit and body of all persons, therefore only manage to cause emotional disturbances but never steal the body or control you will, for the evil that may have a person it never is induced by a spirit but by his own degeneration. Perhaps the reason that an evil spirit adheres to a person, or because for some reason your body accidental act as a gateway between the other world and this. Because it is well known that sometimes the spirits are served objects or homes as a means to that end. If this is true, most would be nothing that the close connection between a person, or rather his body, with a spirit, that because of that link would be found linked to allegedly possessed person. This evil spirit does not dominate the person, but it would not be easy to avoid that sometimes cause interference to your mood or things that surround it. The existence of that link or door, causes whenever that spirit comes back from beyond this world. First is what is the possessed person, rather should be defined as more possessed by the spirit door. These spirits are characterized by not being able to take his own death and try to return to the world going backwards instead of progressing in the spiritual world and prepare for a new reincarnation. In a way, they could be defined as lost spirits. I also find it surprising that there are people who believe that you can produce a moral progress is necessary, that there are beings dedicated only to do evil, so that people become more cautious. Do not understand that to err handedly is not necessary, since it is enough for that one. Because the truth is that whoever does acts selfishly for their own interest and not help anyone. In addition, serious sad life of these hypothetical superior beings, if they had it all his time to devote to doing evil. I think it's difficult enough evolution with all its faults, so that over beings have to be dedicated to that purpose pathetic. For this reason it is logical to consider that only makes sense the existence of the devil, as a symbolic character to represent those beings who made the mistake of choosing the wrong fundamental behavior of his life, but without representing a being in itself. Indeed, the devil, or evil that is essentially psychological in origin. It could be defined as the conceited behavior when it becomes the main feature of a person or a spirit and only creates problems by giving you an unrealistic view of things. Therefore, the demon must destroy and eliminate him from our minds and society, since who intends dealing with evil weakly, only gives you options grown, with evil cannot act with ambiguity, must be destroyed completely. It is necessary to defend well as a core of our being, because if it is ambiguous about evil grows and destroys wearer. A sensible person should be good to good people, but also strong with bad, because only the stupid are good with evil people. We must not confuse justice with weakness. Because self-defense is not only a right but also the pillar on which all social order rests. The truth is that the fate of all beings is directed towards good, because it is the only way to live with our neighbors and thus achieve happiness. It is also regrettable that there are those who invoke the devil hoping to profit from this. These people do not realize that when they do that, only attract to himself spirits of criminals and psychopaths, that only they can cause damage. They seek evil to others, and stupidly they cause themselves, as spiritual laws are not like human laws and those spirits cannot act in the world as they wanted. Because when a spirit loses its body, also loses its ability to influence the material world, except in very exceptional cases. They naively believe that if you make a pact with spirits, their actions may not have consequences, but they have to think that everything in the universe has its action and reaction, and if they seek evil for others resorting to the spirit world, logically that world also have those they ask them accountable for their actions. Guardian angels. Many people believe that there are higher spirits who accompany us throughout our lives to guide us in our spiritual evolution. I think this belief is mistaken, because I consider it unnecessary for a spirit has to stop living their own lives to deal with another. However, if it is possible that the spirits of dead people, especially our own family, join us to help us during the time it takes to become reincarnate. It is also possible that aliens or higher spirits perform functions guidance in exceptional situations. These functions would guide not everyone, because it would only situations in which it would make sense this exclusive dedication to the value that would be for the good of all humanity. The false God. Today, many people saying that denies God does not exist, and that if there should intervene in human life, but citizens would be willing to lose their free will in exchange for an order imposed by superior beings? The answer is certainly no. Since in this case would live in a dictatorship, the world needs to reach the truth that makes free through their own free will to them. But people feel dissatisfied and do not understand that a vitiated atmosphere in which everyone is confronted with all breathe. This occurs because more than miss God there is a false God, i.e. that society has come to worship the false God called Western materialism, proclaiming its defense of democracy but only apparent way as a means to exploit human beings, a false God that considers the mercantilist production as its sole objective, a false God who does not hesitate to sacrifice race, social order or the weather in order to get that purpose. This false God proposes to citizens to accept miscegenation as well when their only effect is to make the working class enslaved by causing the lowering of wages and undermine peaceful coexistence. But most surprising is that the left parties support it moves away from its duty to provide for the good for those who represent, just as happened when those same left parties opposed the abolition of slavery in the United States and worry about those who say workers are at the same time their executioners. I do not intend to praise communism here, because this system is so wrong as above, to hinder progress and free business activity. The followers of communism also make the mistake of blaming religion for the crimes committed by religious organizations, when they are two very different things. Plus the communists in their supreme arrogance intended to propose its ideology as an alternative religion, which is surprising for something that destroys everything it touches. But Western materialism is not a solution to prevail. Commodity production on the division of property, or quality of life, creates a society of trenches within cities to not try to end social precariousness, a society in constant war between citizens themselves, a messy and disjointed society in a social, racial, and cultural chaos. These leftist parties say worry about workers but only intended to create a slave society. In his day did the Athens yellow that made propaganda democracy while enslaving entire villages, trying to take communion citizens with a social model miscegenation based on destroying the quality of life of the working class they claim to defend. You need to create another social model that punish vagrancy, but to help those who are trying to work and fail to create a society without unemployment, a society that gives more importance to the eradication of poverty than commodity production, a society that return to God and reconsider the moral and decent behavior as its core values. It is necessary that the world rejects this false God of Western materialism that promotes disorder and promiscuity, that false God that denies life after death. It is necessary to a life based on decency and not to consider money as the only goal. The true concept of God. It is regrettable to see how those who know science are believed intended to question the existence of God. It seems that his arrogance would take his place. This is the consequence of living in a society that seems to take into account only a materialistic point of view life. These scientists who deny God's existence and spirit think they know everything, but only study the matter from a superficial view, wonder why the particles behave as they do, but they refuse to acknowledge that these there is life particles are beings of grey mind that basically lack the courage to recognize anything of a spiritual nature, even logic. These materialistic scientists say that the existence of God is not logical because they say, what if God created the world, then who created God? They fail to understand that the fact that the classical concept of God can be wrong, does not prevent there may be other true and consistent with a scientific approach. But it is even more foolish to assert that the failure to consider valid the classic definition of God implies that it should be rejected all ethical or religious idea, because religion goes far beyond determining the existence or non-existence of God, because first of all it is a philosophy that seeks to understand the meaning of the cosmos and what science is not yet able to explain. If these materialistic scientists acknowledge mistakes, it is also logical that recognize the right to defend the existence of a philosophy or religion. In my opinion, the classic definition of God as a bearded bee raised in a cloud is wrong, but over time all cultures have believed in some form of God, because it is the easiest way to define the creative mechanism nature, and it is undeniable that the universe has followed a logical process and coordinated development. Therefore, the right thing is to define God as the set of immutable laws that govern the universe since its inception and are grounded in the truth. It is not logical then understand God as something that was before the universe, but God is part of the universe, but as an element coordinator him. It could be said that God is part of us, because somehow we are all creators. God actually consists of everything that exists: planets, stars, galaxies, people, but its exact definition are grounded in the truth laws governing the cosmos. When we think of the divine, it is in those universal laws that thought. Arguably divine is all that is beautiful, and it is well done, it is the best expression of universal perfection. There are also those who deny the existence of God, saying that if there would have to intervene in human directly life or through superior beings to prevent injustice, but if such an occurrence would be nothing more than a dictatorship, the world should be guided by the road right by their own will, not by force, as well as belief is based on seeing God as a person, when it is much more logical to define it as the universal laws coordinators of this scenario we call world, and therefore it is logical that neutral. This does not mean that God does not act, then what we call divine punishment is nothing more than the consequence of forgetting the laws of nature, and many of our ills are the result. Before blaming God, we do an analysis of the reasonableness of our own actions. God does not create the universe as part of it, but it is the element that coordinates, because the universe is not created nor destroyed, only transformed. Another example of arrogance by these materialistic scientists is their stubborn determination to deny the possibility of intelligent life beyond Earth, and especially the possibility that life may have visited Earth at some point. Say the vast distances separating the stars make it impossible, but they as scientists who are should recognize that science which is impossible at a time is routine in the next, and although it is true that it is not easy to cross the distances between the stars, an advanced civilization would have had thousands of millions of years to reach Earth before our present age, to think that such a thing was not able to happen. In addition, there would need to move directly from their planet to us, for those who would come to Earth centuries later would be the descendants of the first space travelers after colonize worlds that would separate the original of our planet. At bottom, this effort to deny this truth seems more an attempt to rob them center stage, as if in the cosmos could not be anyone wiser than they. Prefer flattery by pandering to the official truth that criticism derived defend different positions. These materialistic scientists remind their positions with the time when the Church called unscientific who said that the Earth was not the center of the universe. It is true that in order to affirm the certainty of something must present enough hard evidence, but it is also true that many who are benefiting from these statements because they do not have the courage to recognize when something is logical. New idols. It is pathetic to see how this modern society categorizes old and mediocre because of the wide expanse that idolatry had in antiquity. In the past, it was common in all cultures had many gods and idols with which the company tried to appease his fear of the unknown. Today people are believed superior to them, claiming to have banished such beliefs, but such is not truth, because what difference is there between the ancient gods, each related to something other than nature, and current dolls representing Christs, virgins, and saints? It is that perhaps the fact assert that all these idols are descended from one religion prevents question of a ritual so lacking scientific basis as the ancient idols. Is not it true that these dolls, perhaps virgins and saints, fulfill the same function as in the past met idols? For each job a doll or saint who is invoked asking protection, and even during processions are taken out for a walk as if they were people used. These savage customs are just another form of polytheism concealed under the umbrella of the Catholic Church that tolerates it in order to get the loyalty of followers, but such a practice violates even the very essence of the Christian religion, as can be seen in this biblical quote. Not tremble in fear when they see signs in the sky, as do other nations. Religious customs of these people. They have no value. They go to the forest, cut a tree, and a craftsman is giving it shape. Others adorned with gold and silver. They fasten it with nails and hammer, so you will not fall. These idols cannot speak. They seem scarecrow in a field strewn with melons. They have to take, because they cannot walk. So do not worship. Cannot help them, nor can hurt them. Jeremiah 10. But the Catholic Church tells us that their idols are valid for being of the same religion, but such a statement is false, because his only intention is to exalt itself by the rise of religious characters and control the free will of citizens. Because the more religious characters are converted into idols, more will be idolized the Church itself, and therefore greater will be the manipulation of humanity. The aim sought by the Church is declared itself infallible and get absolute power on earth through the total control of the human mind. Humanity should follow the example of England, as it was an insignificant nation until he decided to throw off the yoke that represented the Roman Church, and from there when he became a great nation and a model for all others. I do not mean that in the world do not exist or have existed people who can be attributed the epithet of righteous or holy, but if you want to find the last place where they should be looking for is precisely religious organizations, because they are much more interested in their own profit and inflator lies the popularity of its members in solving the problems of humanity. Man must seek his own self and reject those tyrants who stand between him and God just for the sake of power, because there is no greater divine value the truth, and the truth that we must worship and not people. These idols represented in plastic is abominable. Create idols representing religious characters, because people are just one more piece of evolution and therefore are exposed to mistakes. It is true that over time many people have contributed to the progress of humanity with their philosophical ideas, but unless proven otherwise these people are men and not gods, and only when it is realized that the truly divine is ideas and not people humanity will truly advance. Another example of idolatry is when confused with Christ Jesus, because Jesus was a man who could make mistakes like everyone else, therefore it is logical and necessary to try to improve their teaching. Christ instead, he is not a person but a symbol that represents those who are messengers of God, i.e. that messengers of God can understand that are those who discover scientific truths and transmit to mankind. That means any man by virtue of its proximity to the truth can come to personify the symbolic figure of Christ, but we must not forget that the divine is ideas, not people, because people are imperfect, so it is absurd to idolize Jesus as if those divine truths that were discovered could have their exclusive property, because before him there were also others who were leading the way. Primitive men were ignorant and were afraid of the unknown, so creating false idols or simple rituals like baptism to show a physical attachment to that which requires a spiritual commitment, but an evolved man must reject all those symbols which only represent appearances, and the facts demonstrate their conversion to the good. The man of the past were baptized with his body, but the man of the future will baptize you with your soul. The essence of happiness. It could be said that happiness is determined by two dimensions that could be defined as crystalline and solar. Solar dimension is what governs the pleasure you get with power and wealth, or provided by technology, and arguably is represented by red color. Crystal dimension is controlling the pleasure derived from simple things, intelligence, and common sense, and is represented by white color. Happiness is the consequence of getting the balance between the two dimensions and can only be achieved in its maximum degree if their rules are respected, for it may be the case that a person is immensely rich and yet unhappy, and another is poor but happy. Money can help achieve happiness, but it is not decisive. To be happy, respect the rules of the crystal dimension is essential. For this reason it is essential to live with decency and honesty. This bipolar feature that has happiness is not exclusive to it, as in the universe most things they do, and is derived from the division of the cosmos in the positive and negative poles, which is the source, for example, of the sexes or the magnetic poles. Those who do not respect these rules of nature become despots, and that makes it harder to feel satisfaction with what they do, as if his soul covered a crust that prevents them from seeing the light. These brutish souls tend to find more money than would normally require because they are unable to feel happy and believe that only with greater wealth they can get. So this kind of people occur more often in positions of importance of what should reciprocate. However, his belief that the money will give them happiness is wrong, because only when you rebalance your soul will find peace sought, only when removed despotism of it and value before the dignity that money feel happiness again, and his soul will free. False philosophy is truly beautiful. Get carried away by the imagination or immerse yourself in extensive philosophical investigations. Through meditation one can travel through time and space and discover those things that only carefully can be understood, but it is important to always remain calm and not be swayed easily by the statements of writers and religious leaders for much profits or contacted proclaim themselves, because in many cases this is nothing more than a strategy of mental manipulation, which It is trying to make us lose our free will so that we submit to their wishes and opinions. In this regard, the official traditionally skeptical science has at least positive that analyzes things in perspective, although it lacks sufficient capacity to recognize the extraordinary when this happens. Sometimes skepticism is nothing more than an excuse to hide the lack of courage to admit the obvious. I do not exclude the possibility that in the past philosophers or prophets may have come in contact with superior beings or aliens who have transmitted them to his teachings, but neither have to accept the arguments of anyone who claims to have had such contacts, without existing evidence regard conclusive. The truth is that when in doubt, most likely truth is usually but not always. In fact, the universe is full of wonders and amazing things, but we must not accept the arguments of those who seek to monopolize the truth for their own benefit, nor the attitude of those who deny everything just because they cannot control. Actually, philosophy and religion are sciences whose mission is the moral development of mankind. Therefore, consider whether the religious foundations have a divine or human origin is secondary. The important thing is to extract the useful values of all ideas in order to create a religion based on truth. For the truly divine is ideas, not people, because the real ideas are those that advance humanity. The solitude of a philosopher. Actually, a philosopher does not tend to seek solitude, that is this a goal in itself, is away from others because they do not understand their concerns. The philosopher really what you want is to discover better than able to share world is not its aim being alone, because nobody could want such a thing. Loneliness is therefore the instrument to concentrate and see the future world uniting science and meditation. These findings most none can understand, because of ignorance and difficulties of the life. Not being loneliness an end but a means, not be ruled out that a philosopher share your life with a family or have a certain social relationship, because life can fit many things in different stages. If we consider that the purpose of philosophy is to improve the quality of life of people, then neither is that there is nothing wrong with the fact that the philosopher his findings apply to himself, living the ideal life you wish for others. Life does not have to be only meditation, is also correct to perform what one has dreamed of. Vanity cults. The truly unfortunate destructive cults is that they believe their followers who are better than others just because they belong to them, inflates his ego so that vanity becomes the main obstacle to leave. Because of considering such, of course it would be traumatic to recognize that not only is not better than others, but also has been stupid enough to think that it is better just for the sake of serving the sect without ever having bothered to prove the veracity of the principles set by the leader, i.e. following the sect just because it does nothing to flatter you, but with the sole purpose to use them. At the end the adept ends up giving more importance to believe better than others, having memorized his postulates that question the meaning of these, and is not that these assumptions may not be true, in part because the most dangerous in these organizations they are not his ideas but the desire of the leader to be considered as an unquestionable being. These people are characterized by a desire for unlimited power, because they actually have the mentality of a dictator or a tyrant. The worst is when they put themselves the epithet infallible in order to deny others the right to use his ability to reason. Many people ask, but then what is the difference between a religion and a destructive cult? It is true that many widespread religious organizations such as Catholicism use their own methods of destructive sects, because like they demand absolute obedience and deny their followers the right to dissent, exalt their religious characters describing them as saints or divine, only hinder an objective and scientific analysis of them, and so have absolute control over their minds, abducting their freedom of thought. For this reason it is important to separate the concept of religion of religious organization, as a religion is a set of philosophical ideas that are part of the culture gathered through the centuries. However, a religious organization only seeks to use religion as an instrument for wrest power from governments and impose a dictatorship. Not that the concept of divine cannot have a logical basis, but divine should be considered only the good ideas, because God is really all that is well done, but it is not correct to apply it to people because they can make mistakes. The ideal religion is one that considers freedom of thought as one of its fundamental principles, without accepting as infallible any of its principles or founders, and has as its ultimate objective to achieve a just and based on truth society. There is nothing wrong in which the company has a religion, rather the contrary. A society cannot be considered evolved without at the same moral, the important thing is to reject those who try to serve religion to gain power as a dictator, trying to tell others what is right and what is not, as if truth be alone in them. So religious organizations must disappear to give rise to a world based on peace and freedom. This does not mean that the universe can be no absolute truths. What is that all citizens have the right to speak freely about it. Therefore, we can say that religion is a philosophy of life that seeks to understand the essence of the universe, but instead religious organizations are parasitic structures of religion, trying to use it to gain world power. There are also those who adhere to sects for lack of affection. That is what really seeking is a group of friends to replace the family who have not, in this case leave the sect with the problem of losing those friendships, as is common in destructive cults induce their followers to reject those who do not belong to them, in order to hinder their march and keep them more controlled. The problem of these sects is that in the end everything is subordinated to the leader and determines they should believe and what not. The measure of truth is what determines the leader becoming the sect into a real mind dictatorship. It is therefore important not relate to any organization that limits freedom of thought. You can always find friends or philosophical orientation without having to rely on such organizations. It is also pathetic to see how some political parties coalesce with religious organizations to increase their power. These parties give these organizations power and money, and in return they give them the excuse to hide their crimes. But they are not better people for opposing these organizations attack religion, because confuse one thing with another, because every society needs a code of moral to live values, which do not need are some organizations that use religion as an excuse to exercise mind control over citizens. Shams. It is regrettable that in this world there are so many impostors, such as in the case of those who write about ufology, did not have the courage to recognize when a statement is a fact and when it is the product of his imagination. Because of him the true facts are considered false and false true, just what suits who try to hide the truth. These scoundrels accused officers scientists from simple in its conclusions, but at least these scientists do not deceive people as they do. These individuals only seek profit using lies to get it. It would be more honest if they were limited to writing science fiction novels rather than deceive people. These individuals do not have dignity and therefore citizens should show their deepest rejection. But unfortunately we live in a miserable society of miserly time, a society in which the law does not pursue criminals but pursues payroll. An offender can be tried for robbery with threats and yet be released after the trial without punishment just for being insolvent, while at the same time other citizen to be convicted huge fines irrelevant things just to have a payroll. This is a supreme act of negligence on the part of those who made the law by showing interest in the mere collection and breaching its duty to do justice. Gives the impression that the world had implemented the law of every man for himself and everything had become a circus of impostors including politicians and the media and all for the profit motive, creating sensational news largely false part service in many cases willing parties to manipulate the electorate exaggerating the crimes of the opposition while hiding their own. But the biggest deception is say that we live in a democracy when it is nothing more than a nest of vipers vying for control over public budgets. Therefore it is a democracy. It is logical to consider an anarchy in which the slogan for politicians is to stand profile and make as if they were not, in order to get the most of public money while in power. They are also despised those materialistic scientists who deny the existence of anything that cannot measure or weigh, because in his supreme arrogance science possessively arise, like a property. They do not accept that the world might be happening events beyond its control. Poverty and dignity. There are two kinds of poverty in the world. One is caused by the lack of the necessary means to have an acceptable life quality material and the other is the consequence of the lack of dignity. One requires financial resources to resolve and the other it requires a sensible behavior. It is common among the rich mock the poor stating that poverty is always their fault and that such a situation can never happen to them, but this claim besides being selfish is deeply hypocritical, because it can be fortunate economically without but being poor in dignity. Those politicians who pretend to say that all criminals are equal, it is not the same one who breaks the law of necessity. Whoever commits crimes, arrogance and evil are also negligible. But these rascals, political friends of offenders, set ridiculous caps on convictions regardless of the seriousness of the crimes in order to get them acquitted as soon as possible. In the case of detention, but they have no qualms about allowing with these absurd laws also remain in freedom murderers sentenced to thousands of years after completing an insignificant part of their sentences without having repented. These rogue politicians emerged from these false democracies would have us believe that they are generous when in fact what they do is betray society with the sole purpose of enriching themselves. Citizens should realize that genuine democracy will only exist when laws can be chosen directly rather than cede power to those impostors who call themselves Democrats. The personality of Jesus. From the moment the Catholic Church grew worried about giving an image of Jesus too deified with frivolous intention to avoid any questioning of his ideas or his person, or rather of the ideas that the Church determined that it had to be attributed Jesus. This was because they wanted to have absolute control over citizens, and for that the best way was I flatter him to the unlimited and thus flatter itself, as the self-proclaimed successor he intended considered the right to decide about the divine and on the human, denying citizens full freedom of thought. It is therefore necessary to fairly and impartially analyze the personality of Jesus out of dogmatism and ideas imposed. First, let me say that it is no disgrace for a man to recognize in him virtues and flaws and wrongs, nor is it a mistake to think that Jesus could have. Jesus was primarily a philosopher and ideologist, and only for it, and deserves respect because he tried in their own way contribute to the moral progress of society, is more or less his success. Some say that Jesus belonged to the sect of the Essenes, or that Christianity is an evolution of Zoroastrianism. There are also those who say that Jesus related the loss of moral values with Roman rule, and therefore considered that the return to a more moral life would bring them freedom. Such hypotheses are possible, but keep in mind that the progress of religions is the result of adding ideas, which is nothing unworthy. Jesus, as the rest of men, may have their successes, but also have the right to be wrong, but undoubtedly his greatest legacy was to instill in citizens that progress is not only achieved through technological development, it is also necessary moral development, and all evolved and civilized society needs a code of conduct solid to be possible coexistence and progress. In my opinion, Jesus did in this regard a successful appeal in defense of peace and justice as essential to seek the welfare of humanity beginning. To understand Jesus is necessary to recognize that no miracles, for his only miracle was getting his teachings reach every corner of the earth to try to make the world had a greater moral training. As for the hypothesis of whether Jesus could be driven higher or extraterrestrial beings, such a thing does not seem impossible, given the vast number of planets and stars that populate our galaxy, but I think of giving would indirectly, as in my opinion any higher than our civilization considered an essential rule of conduct, be willing to help a primitive world, but without this aid constitutes direct interference in the development of its history. So although this moral aid was produced, it is reasonable to think that the content of religious books like the Bible was mostly the product of human beings and not superior beings, as some would have us believe. I also look vulgar who speculate about whether Jesus had children or not, reviewing if they have some kind of inheritance law on an alleged kingdom that never existed, because we must not forget that Jesus was primarily a philosopher or prophet but not a king, and whether he had children, and if not, ridiculous to speculate on the fact that they had some sort of right about his legacy. It is no disgrace to recognize Jesus as the rest of the people committed successes and failures, but it is also fair to acknowledge that it was an exceptional man, because throughout history there have been many who have contributed to the progress of mankind, whether in the philosophical field and technical, and that does not mean they are considered as divine beings. An evolutionary thought is that it sees as divine only to good ideas but not people, because they can make mistakes. You are divine so true that those ideas are in line with the laws governing the cosmos. Jesus was a man who fought for delving into the consciousness of society to improve it, tried to spread the doctrine of good and discover the spiritual to the world values. That in itself is something great without having to resort to elevate him, by so it is only right to recognize the contribution of Jesus to the progress of ideas, but without obsessing about his divine or human nature. After his death many of the things that were said about him were inventions, as even his exact date of birth was known, partly with the well-intentioned favor the expansion of the doctrines he had taught and purpose for which he had given his life, but also in order to use it as a tool for power with illegal and selfish ends, as happened later with the Catholic Church, for it is wrong they blame Jesus for the acts of those who call themselves successors of him. The right thing is to judge each by their own actions. As regards miracles, I do not think those attributed to Jesus are true, but we must not forget that we live in a miraculous world, because from a certain point of view the fact that the sun rises every day also some of it, or the discovery of aviation, sure, who saw flying for the first time an object built by man would say it's a miracle, or the arrival of the first man on the moon. We live in a universe that makes miracles, if for this we mean something surprising facts that appear to violate the laws of nature known so far. However, it is also fair to say that almost everything that relates to the alleged miracles performed by Jesus or that said occurred during his life can be seen as mere inventions. Actually, Christianity was not a major religion until several centuries after his death, and because of the limited accuracy of the information to be had on their lives and the vested interests around almost all of it was invented. Stories like those related to how Jesus was born, the Star of Bethlehem, the Magi, all this simply was aimed on the one hand promote the expansion of their ideas, but also serve as an instrument to impose hegemonic power by the Catholic Church. But most vile part of this was to equate Jesus with God, all with the sole intention to equate itself with him by declaring infallible Pope, and thus subject the world to the most vile religious dictatorship. This is a way what happened during the Middle Ages. A man must value evolved religious figures for the value of his teachings and not by the miracles that will be associated. The fact that Jesus did not do miracles does not mean that it was not right in his ideas. I think it's fair to recognize the value of Jesus as a precursor of human progress, but it is also correct to recognize in him a man who, like others, had their successes but also their mistakes. Divine so are those things that are well done and consistent with universal laws. It is true that those who discover these truths do something big, but that does not mean that their ideas cannot be improved. The truth is that reliable data we have today about Jesus are very few, so any hypothesis about it can be considered definitive, so the desire of the Catholic Church to bridge the discussion of how Jesus was or how was your life, it remains questionable. One possible explanation of why Jesus began to preach might be because it belonged or saw influenced by the ideas of the Essenes. Why those who claim that Jesus was a Jew more be wrong, considering that in those days as in the today religions had many different variations and perhaps Jesus tried to present their own ideas. This hypothesis could also support the belief that Jesus spent some time in the desert, as the Essenes like him were alienated from society for some years. Among the Essenes was common to teach the use of medicinal plants for healing purposes. This might be confused or give rise to the myth of their ability to perform miracles. The wearing of long hair also favors this hypothesis because among the Hebrews was an unequivocal way of knowing when someone was trying to convey their religious dedication and was by so-called Nazarene, consisting among other things, left the long hair, so when Jesus decided to start preaching might decide to wear long hair even without being a Nazarene, as a way to let people know nothing else to see which was the reason for his preaching. What seems pretty clear is that the apostles made the decision to exaggerate the facts of the life of Jesus to see that the simple predicament was not enough to spread their message. From a certain point of view can be called lying, but maybe for them it was the only way to extract a profit to the sacrifice made by his teacher. Therefore, it is wrong to stop and think about whether Jesus was divine or human, because it is no disgrace for a man to recognize that it is. Many men have done great things in history without it being necessary to attribute the adjective divine. Therefore, be considered divine only true ideas, not people, much as the Church tries to make us believe otherwise in order to limit our ability to reason. One way of thinking evolved, is one that values the facts and ideas freely and therefore accepts what he considers true, and rejects what is considered wrong, without accepting any limitations to discuss anything. Because in order to evolve is must be willing to accept that an idea can be wrong or outdated, so from that point to improve it. It is therefore a serious mistake mystify the religious characters, because they are the more idolize further away who does it in a rational and scientific thought, and that is precisely what they look for those who use the myth in order to hinder the free will of society. Because of the dogmas society is immersed in great difficulties to progress in the religious field. Everything would be easier if religious organizations were open to what each citizen could bring them to their progress in the ideological field. Therefore it just would to accept that the founders of their religions, however respectable they were, his ideas were only men, and unless proven otherwise their ideas can and should be improved, as with the rest of men. New Christianity. The world of the future will need a new religion based on truth and freedom of thought and not the dogma imposed by religious organizations, a religion that combines philosophy and science with justice and coexistence as its fundamental principles. Religion can be static, it must evolve as the other sciences. Elevate religious characters is just an obstacle to progress. It is necessary that everyone can participate in its development for the sake of humanity. Throughout history, religious organizations have been limited to use these characters with the sole purpose of obtaining power and money, and no one questioned his ideas imposed on citizens the belief that religion is something immutable and its founders infallible. Such false claims in addition to constitute a serious attack on freedom of thought because they did not hesitate to hunt down and kill those who disagreed with them. Such behavior was not only an act against human rights, but that was precisely the opposite of what many preach. That is an evil act more in line with Satan than Christian philosophy. Only those religious leaders use religion for their own benefit, forgetting why it was created, why it is wrong to blame the precursors of religions of the crimes of those who claim to represent them, as they are impostors. It is fair to give credit to religious figures like Jesus or Buddha, because they made a great effort in the defense of peace and coexistence, as well as contributing to the progress of humanity in the field of philosophy. But it is also fair to recognize that were men like others, certainly exceptional for their intelligence and intuition, but not divine, for divine are only those things that are in line with certain universal truths. However, people can make mistakes. But religious organizations only seek power, and thus the unlimited they idolized to these characters in order to exalt themselves and the world impose a religious dictatorship, which is hypocrisy to call themselves infallible, as does the Pope of Rome. The essence of Christianity is looking good and not power as they do. The ideal religion is one that is not dependent on any religious organization, but is organized by the state and parents' associations and schools. It is also important to remember that the fact that religious organizations have decried religion does not mean that it has no sense, because it is rather the opposite. It is not possible to create a world it evolved if at the same time is not deeply moral. In my opinion, the religion of the future will be that collect the successes of all religions, such as the defense of humanism and eternal life advocated in Christianity or the existence of reincarnation proposed in Buddhism. Mental dictatorship that seeks to impose religious dogma is only an obstacle to the progress of philosophy, and why such organizations should disappear. The world needs is a religion, not a religious organization. The aim of these is to get the power competing with governments. The world of the future will be no different to have a higher technological level, either by having more energy will be different by having a strong code of values that consider truth and justice as its fundamental principles. The doubt. In my opinion, one of the characteristics of the man of the future will be its ability to doubt everything, because only through the ability to doubt progress is possible. I intend to say by this that in the universe there are no absolute truths, but man in its limited possibilities is very difficult to be sure what those truths are. They can be expected, but eventually some of those convictions are modified in whole or in part by new scientific discoveries. It is necessary to doubt, especially in a society like today, where the lie so constant part of their daily activities, as with so many politicians and media using lies or half-truths to gain control over citizens, is essential to maintain doubt about what they tell us. It is good to have principles and convictions, but also need not obsess with them and accept that you can be wrong. Without this course is very difficult to be prepared to adapt to progress. Doubt must be above any myth, belief or religion. It is common to find those who claim to have the absolute right using as evidence facts written in the past for alleged divine beings, but how do we know that such writings truly belong to a being higher? And how can we even be certain whether such a statement writings have not been modified or misunderstanding by the person who wrote it? Only a fool waived his right to doubt and folds to the interpretations of others without further analysis of things, because very divine that we find the ideas written in religious books, that is no reason to give up our own judgment and our ability to doubt, especially when the amount of interest created by many impostors who intermediaries between God and men believe is evident. Not that there are no absolute truths, how hard is knowing what, so the question has to be an essential tool in any developed society. Religious leaders resort to the argument of faith in order to control the minds of his followers, but this is nothing more than a mental maneuver to deprive the right to think freely. faith must never be an argument for losing freedom of thought in favor of those impostors. Another example of how the question is being replaced by dogma are destructive cults. One of its main features is the arrogance with which raised its postulates, i.e. for its adherents their beliefs are considered certain facts while beliefs the others are treated as simple hypotheses, all because they intend to use their supposed knowledge as a kind of a weapon with which to be above others, i.e. knowledge as an instrument of power arise, which they hope others submit to their claims, as if knowledge outside their property, rather than simply something enriching. This is certainly one of the most vile ways in which you can raise the acquisition of knowledge, deny to himself doubt that they require others because they are imbued with vanity. The truth is that these impostors' religion do not care and only used it in order to gain power. Only doubt allows us to be mentally free, therefore those who would have us believe that their beliefs are true without any room for doubt, what they show is their own mediocrity and give us a clear reason to distance ourselves from them. The inner sun. Actually, every man is part of God, every man has a creative capacity and every man has a spirit that possesses eternal life, yet over cosmic life we must live many lives where it is necessary to forget to be able to regenerate. Therefore, it is necessary that every man develop his creative ability beginning to doubt false truths greedy trying to impose. Because in reality God is nothing but the sum of all beings in the universe and the natural laws that govern, laws emanating from the universal truths that are out of time and that form the essence of the universe. The process of evolution of living beings leads indissolubly to understand this truth, and from that moment he begins to doubt the lies around you, and then your soul is free for the first time, because only when you understand that we are all part of God really begins to understand that our future depends on our own efforts, and only then man is able to get rid of these parasites that rob us of our mental freedom, proclaiming himself God's spokesman. It is therefore necessary to develop that inner sun, the capacity of initiative, and seek the truth for yourself, since then the man will be free and the world will have peace. The final contact. It is surprising to see so many scientists claiming find intelligent life in space and discover that they are the same scientists who deny that life may already be present on Earth. Do you not understand that our planet certainly takes many centuries being visited by extraterrestrial civilizations? Especially if we consider that our galaxy has existed for 15 billion years ago. It is true that the distances between stars are great, but it is also true that these extraterrestrial civilizations have had millions of years to reach us by creating colonies in the space between their home planet and ours. But materialistic people always denied such a possibility, because they are not willing to accept anything they cannot understand or control. The world has achieved great development in technological terms, but it remains to achieve the same level on the moral plane. I believe these higher beings have been carrying out work to guide us, and this final contact will not occur until the world reaches its same intellectual level and stop considering the aliens as fitted beings of a high technological level but same ugly, stupid, or evil time, because whoever thinks so what it does is act arrogantly, refusing to accept that these things can be better than them. It is necessary that the world is made a self-criticism and overcomes prejudice and ignorance that prevents him from becoming part of the evolved worlds of space. But it is even more regrettable to see how Earth governments strive to hide who are unable to stop these flying saucers that fly over every day their skies with impunity without being able to do anything about it. I also find it surprising that someone might believe that these governments possess broken dishes or its crew. But, how can you be someone who believes beings with an advantage of thousands of years allow this possible? Unless they do so deliberately, which seems highly unlikely, in my opinion, those who say this are nothing more than charlatans desire to create sensational stories that make money. But the governments of Earth are not interested, deny, for his prestige increases and serves to gain time while finding a way to stop them. Meanwhile our elder brothers continue flying over our skies with bright ships intentional in order to see them and become familiar with them until the time of the final contact possible. Epilogue. In this book I have tried to deepen and broaden the ideas in my previous books. The reader may consider that sometimes have repeated the same themes, but the reason is the importance for me is to emphasize those things that I consider essential. All these books are designed solely to contribute to the progress of humanity through its own self, i.e. the progress of their own conscience and reasoning ability. It is true that my books are generally brief, but it could be said that each of them represents only a chapter in a ledger formed by the sum of them all, because in reality all are interrelated. The reader will see that my books do not conform to current taboos, but that's because my mind is free and these books have not been done in order to earn money or receive prizes unlike many writers of classical literature, but they have been made only to tell the truth. There will also be those who think that my books have impeccable writing of others, but for me writing is not a profession, and I think the important thing is the content that is transmitted and not the external setting in which arises. Sometimes, you need to stop and watch the world perspective, to correct those things that are wrong. Finish.